In the shadowed halls of Hunterbury, a deadly poison claims young Mary Gerrard, and Elinor Carlisle stands, accused, her life hanging by a thread. Was it jealousy over a stolen love, or a darker plot woven in secrets? An anonymous letter whispers of betrayal, a thornless rose hides a lie, and a cunning killer lurks in plain sight. Can Hercule Poirot unravel the truth before the gallows claim an innocent soul? Dive into a web of deceit, where every sip of tea could be your last. Who poisoned Mary, and why? Chapter 1. The Shadow of Suspicion. The courtroom smelled of polished oak and nervous sweat, a stifling blend that clung to the air like a fog. The high ceilings of the Old Bailey loomed over the proceedings, their ornate mouldings casting intricate shadows that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of the chandeliers. Rows of spectators sat shoulder to shoulder, their whispers a low hum, like bees in a hive sensing a coming storm. At the center of it all stood Elinor Carlisle, her posture rigid, her face a mask of porcelain calm. Her dark hair was swept back in a severe bun, and her grey eyes, though steady, held a flicker of something deeper, fear, perhaps, or defiance. She was on trial for her life, accused of a crime so heinous it had set tongues wagging from London's salons to the quiet lanes of Maidensford. The murder of Mary Gerrard, poisoned by morphine at the grand estate of Hunterbury. The prosecution's voice boomed. A barrister named Sir Edwin Gravely, whose florid cheeks and sharp eyes made him seem more predator than advocate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he declared, pacing before the bench, his black robes billowing like a raven's wings, "Miss Elinor Carlisle is no innocent. She is a woman consumed by jealousy, driven to murder by the betrayal of her fiancé, Roderick Wellman, who dared to love another. She had motive, means, and opportunity. The evidence is irrefutable. A vial of morphine, a lunch prepared by her own hands, and a young woman dead in the prime of her life." Elinor's gaze remained fixed on a point beyond the courtroom, as if she could see through the walls to the rolling hills of Hunterbury, where the tragedy had unfolded. The jury, 12 men and women with faces ranging from stern to sympathetic, scribbled notes or stared at her, searching for cracks in her composure. In the gallery, a young man with earnest eyes and a doctor's bearing leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. Dr. Peter Lord, a country physician from Maidensford, had known Elinor since their childhood summers at Hunterbury. His heart ached at the sight of her in the dock, a caged bird in a storm of accusation. He believed in her innocence with a fervor that bordered on obsession, and it was this belief that had driven him to a desperate act, summoning the one man who could unravel the truth. Hercule Poirot sat in a quiet corner of the gallery, his small, fastidious figure almost lost among the crowd. His mustache, waxed to perfection, gleamed under the gaslight, and his green eyes sparkled with curiosity. He had arrived in London only hours ago, persuaded by a fervent letter from Dr. Lord, who had pleaded for his aid. "Monsieur Poirot," the letter had read, "you are my last hope. Elinor Carlisle is innocent, I swear it, but the noose tightens. There is more to this case than meets the eye, just shadow behind the poison. Save her, I beg you." Poirot, ever intrigued by the complexities of the human heart, had agreed to attend the trial, if only to observe, but already his mind was at work, cataloguing every gesture, every word, every flicker of emotion in the room. The prosecution continued its assault, painting a vivid picture of the fateful day at Hunterbury. "On that summer afternoon, Sir," Edwin intoned, "Miss Carlisle invited Mary Gerrard to lunch. A simple affair, one might think sandwiches, tea, a moment of civility. But within those sandwiches, or perhaps the tea, lurked a deadly dose of morphine. Mary Gerrard, a vibrant young woman of 21, collapsed in agony, her life snuffed out before the sun had set. And who prepared that meal? Who had access to the morphine? Elinor Carlisle, and Elinor Carlisle alone." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Poirot's eyes narrowed. The simplicity of the narrative was too neat, too convenient. He disliked neatness in a murder case. It often concealed a lie. His gaze drifted to Elinor, who had not flinched at the accusation. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed no tremor, but Poirot sensed a storm beneath her calm. Was it guilt, or the weight of injustice? He could not yet say. The defense, led by a wiry barrister named Mr. Seddon, rose to counter. His voice was softer, almost apologetic, as if he knew the jury had already half made their minds. "My learned friend paints a vivid tale," he began, but it is just that, a tale. Where is the proof that Miss Carlisle administered the poison? Where is the vial, the syringe, the concrete evidence? Suspicion is not fact, and my client is a woman of impeccable character, bereaved by the loss of her aunt and now falsely accused of a crime she did not commit. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. The defense was weak, grasping at straws. Without new evidence, Elinor's fate seemed sealed. Yet something in Seddon's words caught his attention. The mention of Elinor's aunt, Mrs. Laura Woolman, the old woman's death, just weeks before Mary's had left Elinor a fortune and, according to the prosecution, a motive. But Poirot wondered, was Laura's death truly natural, as reported, or was it another thread in this tangled web? As the court adjourned for a brief recess, Dr. Lord seized his chance. He navigated the crowded gallery, his tweed jacket rumpled from hours of anxious waiting, and approached Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice low but urgent, "thank you for coming. I know you don't take every case, but Elinor, she's not what they say. She couldn't have done this. I've known her since we were children. She's kind, reserved, not a murderer." Poirot regarded the young doctor with a faint smile. "Monsieur Lord, your faith is admirable, but faith alone does not unravel a mystery. Tell me, what is it that convinces you of her innocence, and what is this shadow you mentioned in your letter?" Peter hesitated, his eyes darting to the courtroom floor where Elinor was being led away by a bailiff. "It's a feeling, at first, but there's more. A letter came to Hunterbury, anonymous, just before Mary's death. It warned Elinor about someone meddling in her affairs, someone close to her aunt. I think it was about Mary, or maybe Nurse Hopkins, who was always hovering about. Elinor ignored it, but I kept it. It's in my possession, if you'll see it." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "An anonymous letter, most intriguing. And you say it arrived before the tragedy?" "Yes, about a week before. I didn't think much of it at the time, village gossip, you know, but now it feels like a clue. Please, Monsieur Poirot, will you take the case? I'll pay whatever you ask." Poirot waved a hand dismissively. "Money, P.A. It is the puzzle that interests Hercule Poirot. This letter, this shadow you speak of, it suggests a mind at work, a mind that wishes to obscure the truth. I will investigate, Monsieur Lord, but I make no promises. The truth, she is a stubborn mistress." Peter's face lit with relief, though his eyes remained haunted. "Thank you. I'll bring the letter to your hotel tonight. What do you need?" "From me, everything," Poirot said simply. "Every detail of that day, every person who crossed the threshold of Hunterbury, and above all, the truth about Mademoiselle Carlisle and Mademoiselle Gerrard, their hearts, their secrets, their enemies." As the recess ended, the courtroom reconvened, and Poirot settled back to observe. The prosecution called its first witness, Nurse Jessie Hopkins, a stout woman with a brisk manner and eyes that seemed to see too much. She testified about the day of the murder, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "I was there to help Miss Carlisle after Mrs. Wellman's death," she said. "We had lunch together, Miss Carlisle, Mary, and I, sandwiches, tea, nothing out of the ordinary. But Mary, she took ill so quickly. I tried to help her, but it was too late." Poirot's fingers twitched, as if itching to rearrange the pieces of this puzzle. Nurse Hopkins' story was polished, almost rehearsed, and yet there was something in her tone, a faint note of satisfaction. Perhaps he made a mental note to investigate her further. The mention of the lunch, too, intrigued him. Morphine, he knew, was tasteless, odorless, easily concealed. But how had it been administered, and by whom? The day wore on, with more witnesses, servants, villagers, a chemist who confirmed the presence of morphine in Mary's system. Each testimony tightened the noose around Elinor's neck. Yet Poirot's mind was elsewhere, already reconstructing the scene at Hunterbury. He pictured the grand estate, its gardens lush with summer blooms, its rooms heavy with secrets. He imagined Elinor, poised and grieving, preparing a meal for a woman she supposedly hated, and he thought of the anonymous letter, a whisper of malice that had arrived too late to save Mary. Gerrard. As the court adjourned for the day, Poirot lingered, watching Elinor as she was escorted out. For the briefest moment, her eyes met his, and he saw not guilt but a quiet, desperate plea. It was enough to cement his resolve. He turned to Peter, who had waited anxiously nearby. "Monsieur Lord," he said, "we begin tonight. Bring me the letter, and tell me all you know of Hunterbury. of Elinor, of Mary. The truth lies not in this courtroom, but in the shadows of that estate. Peter nodded, his jaw set. I'll tell you everything, but please, hurry. The trial won't last much longer. Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. Haste, monsieur, is the enemy of precision. But fear not, Hercule Poirot does not fail when the truth is at stake. As the crowd dispersed into the London dusk, Poirot stepped into the street, his mind alight with possibilities. The anonymous letter, the morphine, the lunch, the nurse with her too perfect story each was a thread in a tapestry of deceit. He would pull them apart, one by one, until the shadow of suspicion gave way to the light of truth. For now, Elinor Carlisle's fate hung in the balance, but Hercule Poirot had taken the case, and that was a spark of hope in the gathering dark. Her clothes even sent her abroad for a time. Everyone thought it was just kindness, but there were whispers in the village. Some said Mary was more than just a gardener's daughter to her. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Whispers, you say, and what did these whispers suggest? Peter lowered his voice, as if the walls themselves might listen. That Mary was Mrs. Wellman's daughter. Illegitimate, of course. No one could prove it, but the way Mrs. Wellman treated her, it was more than charity. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes alight with interest. And if this were true, what would it mean for the inheritance? Madame Wellman died without a will. Yes, Peter confirmed. Everything went to Elinor as her closest living relative. But if Mary was her daughter, then the estate might have been contested. Poirot finished a most intriguing possibility. And who else knew of these whispers? Peter shrugged. The whole village, I suppose. Mrs. Slattery, the grocer's wife, loves to gossip, and Nurse Hopkins, she was close to Mrs. Wellman. If anyone knew the truth, it would be her. The next morning Poirot ventured into Maidensford village, a quaint cluster of stone cottages and narrow lanes. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of baking bread from the local bakery. Poirot's destination was the grocer's shop, where Mrs. Slattery held court behind a counter laden with jars of sweets and tins of tea. Mrs. Slattery was a plump woman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper memory. She eyed Poirot with curiosity. As he entered, his foreign accent and impeccable suit marking him as an outsider. "You're that detective fellow, aren't you?" she said, folding her arms. "Come about poor Mary Gerrard, I reckon." Poirot bowed slightly. "Madame Slattery, your reputation for insight precedes you. I am Hercule Poirot, and I seek the truth about the events at Hunterbury. You knew Mademoiselle Gerrard?" Mrs. Slattery nodded, her expression softening. "Knew her since she was a babe. Sweet girl, Mary was. Too good for this world, if you ask me. Always helping her father well, Bob Gerrard, that is. Though some say he wasn't her real father." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And who, pray, do they say was her real father?" Mrs. Slattery leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sir Louis Rycroft, that's who. He and Mrs. Wellman were close. Years ago, before she married Mr. Wellman, everyone knew they had a fling. When Mary was born, and Eliza Gerrard claimed her as her own, folks started talking. Mary had Mrs. Wellman's eyes, you see, same shade of green, same spark." "And Nurse Hopkins?" Poirot asked. "Did she ever speak of this?" Mrs. Slattery's lips pursed. "That one. She's a sly one, mark my words. Always hovering around Mrs. Wellman, whispering in her ear. I saw her once, arguing with Mary down by the lodge. Looked proper heated, though I couldn't hear what they said." Poirot filed this away, his mind racing. A heated argument, a thornless rose, a nurse with a questionable story. The threads were multiplying, but the tapestry remained incomplete. Back at Hunterbury, Poirot stood alone in the rose garden, the zephyr-and-druin swaying gently in the breeze. He closed his eyes, letting the pieces of the puzzle arrange themselves in his mind. The anonymous letter that had brought him here, accusing Elinor of murder, had been written in a careful hand. Its tone calculated to incite panic. But who had written it, and why? He recalled Horlick's words about Nurse Hopkins' claim of a rose-thorn scratch. The zephyr-and-druin, with its smooth stems, could not have caused such a mark. Was it a clumsy lie, or a deliberate misdirection? And then there was Mary Gerrard's parentage, a secret that could have shifted the entire motive for her death. If Nurse Hopkins knew of it, what else did she know? And what had she hoped to gain? As the wind whispered through the roses, opened his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. The truth was close. He could feel it, like the scent of rain before a storm. The discrepancy of the thornless rose was no mere detail, it was a crack in the facade of a carefully constructed lie, and Hercule Poirot was determined to widen that crack until the entire edifice of deception came tumbling down. Her clothes even sent her abroad for a time. Everyone thought it was just kindness, but there were whispers in the village. Some said Mary was more than just a gardener's daughter to her. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Whispers, you say, and what did these whispers suggest? Peter lowered his voice, as if the walls themselves might listen. That Mary was Mrs. Wellman's daughter. Illegitimate, of course. No one could prove it, but the way Mrs. Wellman treated her, it was more than charity. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes alight with interest. And if this were true, what would it mean for the inheritance? Madame Wellman died without a will. Yes, Peter confirmed. Everything went to Elinor as her closest living relative. But if Mary was her daughter, then the estate might have been contested. Poirot finished. A most intriguing possibility. And who else knew of these whispers? Peter shrugged. The whole village, I suppose. Mrs. Slattery, the grocer's wife, loves to gossip, and Nurse Hopkins, she was close to Mrs. Wellman. If anyone knew the truth, it would be her. The next morning Poirot ventured into Maidensford village, a quaint cluster of stone cottages and narrow lanes. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of baking bread from the local bakery. Poirot's destination was the grocer's shop, where Mrs. Slattery held court behind a counter laden with jars of sweets and tins of tea. Mrs. Slattery was a plump woman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper memory. She eyed Poirot with curiosity as he entered, his foreign accent and impeccable suit marking him as an outsider. "You're that detective fellow, aren't you?" she said, folding her arms. "Come about poor Mary Gerrard, I reckon." Poirot bowed slightly. "Madame Slattery, your reputation for insight precedes you. I am Hercule Poirot, and I seek the truth about the events at Hunterbury. You knew Mademoiselle Gerrard?" Mrs. Slattery nodded, her expression softening. "Knew her since she was a babe. Sweet girl, Mary was. Too good for this world, if you ask me. Always helping her father well, Bob Gerrard, that is. Though some say he wasn't her real father." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And who, pray, do they say was her real father?" Mrs. Slattery leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sir Louis Rycroft, that's who. He and Mrs. Wellman were close. Years ago, before she married Mr. Wellman, everyone knew they had a fling. When Mary was born, and Eliza Gerrard claimed her as her own, folks started talking. Mary had Mrs. Wellman's eyes, you see, same shade of green, same spark." "And Nurse Hopkins?" Poirot asked. "Did she ever speak of this?" Mrs. Slattery's lips pursed. "That one, she's a sly one, mark my words. Always hovering around Mrs. Wellman, whispering in her ear. I saw her once, arguing with Mary down by the lodge. Looked proper heated, though I couldn't hear what they said." Poirot filed this away, his mind racing. A heated argument, a thornless rose, a nurse with a questionable story. The threads were multiplying, but the tapestry remained incomplete. Back at Hunterbury, Poirot stood alone in the rose garden, the zephyrin druin swaying gently in the breeze. He closed his eyes, letting the pieces of the puzzle arrange themselves in his mind. The anonymous letter that had brought him here, accusing Elinor of murder, had been written in a careful hand. Its tone calculated to incite panic. But who had written it, and why? He recalled Horlick's words about Nurse Hopkins' claim of a rose-thorn scratch. The zephyrin druin, with its smooth stems, could not have caused such a mark. Was it a clumsy lie, or a deliberate misdirection? And then there was Mary Gerrard's parentage, a secret that could have shifted the entire motive for her death. If Nurse Hopkins knew of it, what else did she know? And what had she hoped to gain? As the wind whispered through the roses, opened his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. The truth was close. He could feel it, like the scent of rain before a storm. The discrepancy of the thornless rose was no mere detail, it was a crack in the facade of a carefully constructed lie, and Hercule Poirot was determined to widen that crack until the entire edifice of deception came tumbling down. Chapter 3. The Poisoned Feast. The summer air hung heavy over Hunterbury, its sprawling gardens and ivy-clad walls cloaking secrets as old as the estate itself. Hercule Poirot stood at the edge of the manicured lawn, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the dukest grass. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the scene before him, the stone terrace where the fatal lunch had taken place. the rose trellis casting dappled shadows, and the distant lodge where Mary Gerrard had lived. Her final days, the tragedy of her death lingered here, a silent scream etched into the very stones. Poirot's moustache twitched as he murmured to himself, "The truth. It is like the perfect soufflé. It requires precision, patience, and a touch of audacity to bring it to light." He had come to reconstruct the day of the poisoning, to walk the paths of those who had sat at that fateful table. Elinor Carlisle, accused of murder, Mary Gerrard, the vibrant young woman now dead, and Nurse Jessie Hopkins, whose calm professionalism seemed to mask something Poirot could not yet name. The prosecution's case was Claire morphine in the tea, a jealous Elinor driven to eliminate her rival. Yet Poirot's instincts, honed over decades of unraveling human deceit, whispered of a deeper plot, a poison not just in the cup but in the hearts of those present. He stepped onto the terrace, where a rotund table still stood, its surface weathered by sun and rain. Closing his eyes, he summoned the scene as it had been described in the trial transcripts. It was a warm July day, the kind that invited languid conversation and iced drinks. Elinor, poised but pale, had prepared sandwiches, cucumber, and salmon, the court had noted. Nurse Hopkins, ever efficient, had brewed a pot of tea, her movements brisk as she poured for herself and Mary. Elinor had declined the tea, citing a headache, and sipped water instead. All three had eaten the sandwiches, but only Mary and Hopkins had drunk from the teapot. Within hours, Mary was dead, her body racked by the lethal grip of morphine. Hopkins, pale and shaken, had claimed a sudden illness and retreated to wash the dishes alone. Elinor, numb with shock, had called for help. Poirot opened his eyes, his gaze settling on the teapot's resting place, now empty. "The tea," he said softly. "It is the key." But how was the poison delivered, and by whose hand? He paced the terrace, his small frame casting a long shadow. The discrepancy in Hopkins' behavior nagged at him, her pallor, her solitary dishwashing, her quick recovery. And then there was the anonymous letter, its venomous words accusing Elinor of sinister intent. Someone had wanted her to take the fall, but why? His reverie was broken by the crunch of gravel behind him. Turning, he saw a young man approaching, his broad shoulders slouched, his face etched with unease. The man tipped his cap, revealing sun-bleached hair and eyes that held a flicker of defiance. "Mr. Poirot, sir. I'm Ted Biglin, village lad. Heard you were poking about Hunterbury, asking questions." His voice was rough, but there was a sincerity in it that Poirot noted at once. "Indeed, Monsieur Bigland," Poirot replied, inclining his head. "And you, I presume, have something to share about the tragedy that befell Mademoiselle Gerrard." Ted shifted his weight, glancing toward the lodge. I knew Mary. Knew her well, you might say. She was special, kind, but not soft, if you get my meaning. Didn't deserve what happened." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I don't believe Miss Carlisle did it, neither, not her style." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And what, pray tell, leads you to this conclusion?" "The heart, it can cloud the judgment, Nan." Ted flushed, but held his ground. "It ain't just my heart talking. Mary told me things, before she passed. She was worried, see, not about Miss Carlisle, but about Roddy, Mr. Wellman, that is. He'd been hanging about, making eyes at her, saying things that made her uneasy. She didn't want his attention, but he wouldn't let up." Poirot's moustache quivered with interest. Roderick Wellman, Elinor's fiancé, whose infatuation with Mary had shattered their engagement. The prosecution had framed it as Elinor's motive, jealousy over a love lost, but Ted's words suggested a different angle, one where Mary herself had been a reluctant player in a romantic tangle. "Tell me, Monsieur Bigland," Poirot said, his voice smooth as silk. "What precisely did Mademoiselle Gerrard say about Monsieur Wellman's advances?" Ted hesitated, then leaned closer, as if the roses themselves might eavesdrop. "She said he was persistent, kept writing her notes, asking to meet in the gardens at night. She showed me one, once, all flowery words, but there was a push to it, like he thought he could win her over just 'cause he was rich." Mary laughed it off, but I could tell it bothered her. She said she didn't want to upset Miss Carlisle, who'd always been kind to her. Poirot nodded, filing the information away. "And did Mademoiselle Gerrard mention anyone else? Perhaps Nurse Hopkins, or someone from the village?" Ted frowned, scratching his chin. "Not Hopkins, no. but she did say something odd about the lodge where she lived with her dad, Bob Gerrard, God rest him. Said she'd found a letter hidden in an old book. Didn't tell me what it said, just that it made her feel strange, like she didn't know who she was anymore. Poirot's heart quickened. A letter, concealed and cryptic, could be a thread to unravel the entire tapestry. This letter, Monsieur Bigland, did Mary say where she found it, or what became of it? Ted shook his head. She clammed up after that, said she'd handle it herself. That was a week before the lunch, before his voice trailed off, and he looked away, his fists clenching. Poirot placed a gentle hand on the young man's arm. You have been most helpful, monsieur. The truth, it is like a buried seed, it requires care to bring it to the surface. If you recall anything more, you will find me. Ted nodded, his eyes glistening. I just want justice for Mary. She deserved better. With that, he turned and trudged back toward the village. His figure swallowed by the morning mist, Poirot stood alone, his mind a whirl of possibilities. Roddy's unwelcome advances, Mary's discovery of a mysterious letter. Hopkins' peculiar behavior was a puzzle with too many pieces, yet he sensed they were beginning to fit. He returned to the terrace, imagining the lunch once more. The sandwiches, shared by all, had been deemed safe by the coroner's report. The tea, however, was another matter. Morphine, tasteless and deadly, could have been slipped into the pot or the cup, but how, and by whom? He crouched beside the table, examining the flagstones as if they might whisper their secrets. A faint stain caught his eye, barely visible. Against the weathered stone, it was a small, irregular mark, the color of dried tea. Poirot's lips curved into a smile. Mon Dieu, the little details, they are the breadcrumbs of truth. He scraped a sample into a small envelope, tucking it into his pocket. It might be nothing, but Poirot never dismissed the seemingly insignificant. His next step was to speak with those who had been closest to the scene. He made his way to the village, where the local pub, the Red Lion, served as a hub of gossip and ale. The interior was dim, its wooden beams sagging under the weight of years. A handful of patrons nursed their pints, their eyes tracking Poirot's immaculate suit with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Behind the bar stood Mrs. Slattery, a stout woman with a sharp tongue and sharper ears. She wiped a glass with a rag, her gaze narrowing as Poirot approached. "You're that detective, ain't you? The one sniffing about Hunterbury. What's a fancy gent like you want with the likes of us?" Poirot bowed slightly, his charm undeterred. "Madame Slattery, your reputation for wisdom precedes you. I seek only to understand the events at Hunterbury, and I believe you may hold a key to the truth." Mrs. Slattery snorted, but her eyes twinkled with interest. "Flattery'll get you a pint, maybe, but not much else. What's it you want to know?" Poirot leaned on the bar, his voice low. "Tell me of the day Mademoiselle Gerrard died. Were you at Hunterbury, or did you hear of the lunch from those who were?" Mrs. Slattery set the glass down, her hands resting on her hips. "I wasn't there, mind, but my niece, Jenny, she's a maid at the big house. She saw plenty that day," said Miss Carlisle was quiet, like she was carrying a weight. Nurse Hopkins was bustling about, making tea, acting like she owned the place. Jenny said Hopkins looked poorly after the lunch, all pale and sweaty, but she insisted on washing up herself. "Didn't let Jenny near the kitchen." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And Mademoiselle Gerrard, did your niece observe her demeanor?" Mrs. Slattery nodded, her voice softening. "Jenny said Mary was her usual self, bright, chatting about the gardens, but she noticed Mary kept glancing at Miss Carlisle, like she was trying to say something without words. Then, after the tea, Mary got quiet, said she felt dizzy. Jenny thought it was the heat, but she trailed off, shaking her head." Poirot's mind raced. Mary's glances at Elinor suggested a shared secret, or perhaps an apology. And Hopkins' insistence on washing the dishes alone. Could she have been hiding evidence? "Madame, did your niece mention anything unusual about the tea, or the dishes?" Mrs. Slattery frowned, thinking, "Come to think of it, Jenny said the teapot was odd, had a funny smell, not like proper tea. She didn't think much of it then, but after Mary died, she wondered Hopkins scrubbed that pot like her life depended on it." Poirot's heart leaped. A strange smell in the teapot could indicate a chemical. Perhaps the morphine itself. "This is most illuminating, madame. One final question. Did you or your niece hear of any tensions between Mademoiselle Gerrard and others at Hunterbury? Perhaps with Monsieur Wellman, or Nurse Hopkins?" Mrs. Slattery's lips pursed. "Roddy Wellman was a troublemaker, if you ask me. always chasing skirts. Never mind, he was engaged to Miss Carlisle. Jenny saw him talking to Mary in the rose garden once, too close for comfort. Mary pushed him away, but he didn't look happy about it. As for Hopkins, she kept to herself, but Jenny said she was always watching Mary, like a cat with a mouse. Poirot thanked her profusely, slipping a few coins across the bar for her trouble. As he stepped back into the sunlight, his mind was a storm of connections. Roddy's advances, Hopkins' watchful gaze, the teapot's strange odorate, all pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan. But he needed more, something tangible to tie it together. His next stop was the lodge, where Mary had lived with her legal father, Ephraim Bob Gerrard. The small cottage was tidy, its windows adorned with lace curtains. Poirot knocked, and the door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Bishop, the housekeeper who had stayed on to maintain the place after Bob's death. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice wary, "I heard you were coming. What do you want with the lodge?" Poirot smiled, his manner disarming. "Madame Bishop, I seek only to honor the memory of Mademoiselle Gerrard by uncovering the truth of her death. May I see her room, and perhaps learn more of her life here?" Mrs. Bishop hesitated, then stepped aside. "Mind you, don't disturb anything. Mary was a good girl, didn't deserve what happened." She led him to a small upstairs room, its walls papered in faded roses. A single bed stood against one wall, beside a desk cluttered with books and trinkets. Poirot's eyes scanned the space, noting a photograph of Mary with an older man, Bob Gerrard, presumably. Her smile was radiant, but her eyes held a hint of melancholy. "Madame," Poirot said, turning to Mrs. Bishop, "did Mademoiselle Gerrard ever speak of a letter she found, perhaps among her father's things?" Mrs. Bishop's brow furrowed. "A letter? Not to me. She didn't, but she was rummaging through Bob's old papers a few weeks before she died. Said she was sorting things out, but I saw her reading something, her face all pale. She tucked it away quick when she saw me." Poirot's pulse quickened. "And where might these papers be now?" Mrs. Bishop pointed to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. "In there, I reckon. Haven't touched it since she passed." With her permission, Poirot opened the chest, its hinges groaning. Inside were stacks of letters, bills, and photographs, the detritus of a life. He sifted through them carefully, his gloved hands deft. Near the bottom, he found an envelope, its edges yellowed with age. It was addressed to Bob Gerrard, the handwriting, elegant but unfamiliar. Poirot opened it, his breath catching as he read. "My dearest Ephraim, I must tell you the truth, though it breaks my heart. Mary is not ours, not by blood. She is the daughter of Laura Wellman and Sir Lewis Rycroft, born in secret and entrusted to us to raise as our own. I swore to keep this silent, but I cannot carry it to my grave. Forgive me, and protect our girl. Yours, always." Eliza Pro's mind reeled. Mary, the illegitimate child of Laura Wellman, stood to inherit a fortune if her parentage were proven. This letter, if authentic, changed everything. It gave someone, perhaps Hopkins, perhaps another, a motive to silence Mary before she could claim her birthright. He tucked the letter into his pocket, thanking Mrs. Bishop with a bow. As he left the lodge, the weight of the discovery settled over him. The lunch at Hunterbury was no simple act of jealousy, it was a calculated strike. A poison brewed, not just in a teapot but in a web of greed and deception. Back at Hunterbury, Poirot sought out Horlick, the gardener, who was pruning the rose trellis near the terrace. The old man's hands were gnarled, but his eyes were sharp as he greeted Poirot. "Back again, sir. Find what you were looking for." Poirot smiled. "Perhaps, Monsieur Horlick, but I have one more question. On the day of the lunch, did you see Nurse Hopkins near the terrace, perhaps after the meal?" Horlick paused, his shears glinting in the sun. I did. She was out here, alone, carrying that teapot. Looked like she was rinsing it under the garden tap. Thought it odd, since the kitchen's just inside." Poirot's heart sang. "And her demeanor, monsieur, was she calm or agitated?" Horlick scratched his head. "Agitated, I'd say, kept looking over her shoulder, like she didn't want to be seen. Her face was white as chalk, too." Poirot nodded, his mind racing. Hopkins rinsing the teapot outside, her pallor, her solitary dishwashing, it all pointed to a woman desperate to erase evidence. The morphine, he suspected, had been in the tea, and Hopkins had ensured no trace remained. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Poirot stood on the terrace once more. The estate, cloaked in twilight, the pieces were falling into place, but the picture was not yet complete. Hopkins' behavior suggested guilt, but why frame Elinor? And what of Roddy's role, or the letter that threatened to append Mary's legacy? He turned toward the house, his resolve hardening. The feast was poisoned. But not just with morphine. There is a poison of the soul at work here, and Hercule Poirot will expose it. With that, he strode into the gathering dark, ready to unravel the next thread in this deadly tapestry. Chapter 4. The Mask of Innocence. The morning air hung heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth as Hercule Poirot stepped out of his chauffeured car, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the damp gravel path leading to Hunterbury's sprawling estate. The manor loomed ahead, its ivy-clad walls whispering of secrets long buried beneath layers of propriety. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the scene, noting the overgrown rosebeds and the faint glint of a greenhouse in the distance, where the infamous Zephyrin ruin roses grew thornless, yet now entangled in a web of suspicion. His moustache twitched as he adjusted his hat, his mind already dissecting the contradictions of the case. Elinor Carlisle, accused of poisoning Mary Gerrard, stood at the heart of a storm, her serene composure in the courtroom a stark contrast to the chaos of motives swirling around her. Today, Poirot would question Nurse Jessie Hopkins, whose calm professionalism seemed to mask something far more sinister. Inside the manor, the air was cool and musty, the kind of stillness that clung to old houses where tragedy had taken root. Poirot was ushered into a small parlour by Mrs. Bishop, the housekeeper, whose pinched face betrayed her unease at his presence. "Mr. Poirot, sir," she said, her voice tight. "Nurse Hopkins is waiting in the drawing-room. I'll have tea brought in, if you please." Her eyes darted toward the hallway, as if expecting a spectre to emerge from the shadows. "Mercy, Madame Bishop," Poirot replied, his tone smooth but probing. "And tell me, how long have you served at Hunterbury?" 20 years, sir," she answered, wringing her hands. "Since Miss Elinor was a child. A fine lady, she is, despite what they say. I can't believe she'd harm anyone." Her words carried a tremor of loyalty, but Poirot noted the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Loyalty, he knew, could blind as much as it bound. He entered the drawing-room, where Nurse Jessie Hopkins sat by a window, her starched uniform crisp against the faded velvet of the chair. She was a woman of middle age, her face plain but composed, her grey eyes steady as they met Poirot's. Yet there was something in her posture, slight rigidity. Perhaps that hinted at a guard carefully maintained. "Monsieur," she said, rising with a practiced smile, "I've heard of your reputation. I hope I can be of help in this dreadful business." Poirot inclined his head, his gaze never leaving her face. "Mademoiselle Hopkins, I am here to understand the events at Hunterbury. You were present at the lunch where Mademoiselle met her tragic end. Tell me, if you please, exactly what transpired." Hopkins folded her hands, her fingers interlacing with deliberate care. "It was a simple affair, really. Miss Elinor prepared sandwiches, ham and mustard, I believe. I made the tea myself. We all ate together in the morning room. Mary seemed fine at first, chatting about her plans to study abroad. Then, quite suddenly, she grew pale, clutched her chest, and collapsed. It was dreadful." Her voice wavered, but Poirot detected a rehearsed quality, as if the words had been polished like a well-worn script. "And the morphine?" Poirot pressed, his tone deceptively mild. "It is said to have been in the tea. Yet you drank the tea as well, did you not? And you suffered no ill effects?" Hopkins' smile tightened. "I was fortunate, I suppose. Perhaps I took less, or my constitution is stronger. I can't explain it, Monsieur Poirot. I only know poor Mary is gone, and Miss Elinor." She trailed off, her eyes dropping to her lap. Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on his cane. "And this mark on your wrist, mademoiselle, you said it was from a rose thorn." "Oui, a scratch from the garden." Hopkins glanced at her wrist, where a faint red mark lingered beneath her cuff. "Yes, I must have caught it while tending the roses with Horlick. Those Zephyrin druins are beautiful, but careless hands can still be pricked." Poirot murmured, his eyes narrowing. "For the Zephyrin druin, it is a rose without thorns. A most unusual choice for a scratch, would you not agree?" For a fraction of a second, Hopkins' composure faltered, her lips parting as if to protest. Then she recovered, her smile returning like a curtain drawn over a stage. "I must have misspoken. Perhaps it was another plant, or a fall." "I'm no gardener, monsieur." Poirot nodded, but his mind was alight with suspicion. The thornless rose was no mere detail, it was a crack in the facade, a clue that Nurse Hopkins' story was not as seamless as she wished it to appear. He shifted his approach, his voice softening. "Tell me of Mademoiselle Carlisle. You knew her well, as her aunt's nurse." Hopkins hesitated, then spoke with measured care. "Miss Elinor is reserved. She loved her aunt dearly, but I sensed strain between her and Mr. Roddy. He was quite taken with Mary. You see, it caused tension. I don't like to speak ill, but Elinor could be cold at times. I wondered if she resented Mary's presence." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Resented enough to kill, perhaps." Hopkins' hands tightened in her lap. "I wouldn't say that. I only know what I saw: the sandwiches, the tea, the tragedy. The police found morphine in the teapot, and Elinor had access to it. I hate to think it, but the facts are what they are." "Facts," Poirot echoed, his tone laced with irony. "They are like the pieces of a puzzle, mademoiselle, but one must arrange them correctly to see the picture." He rose, his movements deliberate. "I thank you for your time. I may return with more questions." As he left the drawing room, Poirot's mind churned. Hopkins' story was plausible, yet it lacked the ring of truth. Her wrist mark, her vague explanations, her quickness to point to Elinorette, all suggested a performance. But to what end? He needed more than intuition. He needed evidence. The village of Maidensford was a cluster of stone cottages nestled in a valley, its cobbled streets alive with the hum of gossip. Poirot made his way to the local chemist's shop, a quaint establishment with a bell that jingled as he entered. Mr. Grayson, the chemist, was a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, his hands busy sorting vials behind the counter. "Monsieur Grayson," Poirot began, his voice warm but authoritative. "I am investigating the tragedy at Hunterbury. You supplied medicines to the household." "Oui." Grayson nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. I did, mostly for Mrs. Wellman's ailments: heart tonics, sedatives, the like. Nurse Hopkins often collected them. "And morphine?" asked, his gaze steady. Grayson's brow furrowed. "Morphine was prescribed for Mrs. Wellman's pain, yes, but it was tightly controlled. Nurse Hopkins reported a tube missing a month before the incident, said it was misplaced during a house call. I reported it to the authorities, as required." Poirot's mustache twitched. "A missing tube, you say? And this was not investigated further?" "Not that I know of," Grayson replied. "The police seemed focused on Miss Elinor after Mary's death. The morphine in the teapot matched the type we supplied, so they had their suspect." Poirot thanked the chemist and stepped back into the street, his mind racing. A missing morphine tube, a convenient scapegoat in Elinor, and now a thornless rose that contradicted Hopkins' tale. The pieces were scattered, but they were beginning to form a pattern. He decided to seek out another perspective, one less polished, perhaps more revealing. At the edge of the village, Ted Bigland's cottage was a modest affair, its garden bursting with wildflowers. Ted, a broad-shouldered young man with calloused hands, was Mary Gerrard's sweetheart, and his grief was palpable as he invited Poirot inside. The parlor was cluttered with mementos. A photograph of Mary, her smile radiant, sat on the mantel. "Ted," Poirot said gently, "I know this is painful, but I must understand Mary's final days. You saw her before the lunch at Hunterbury?" Ted nodded, his eyes red-rimmed. "Aye, the day before. She was troubled. Mr. Poirot said Mr. Roddy was acting too familiar, writing her letters, lingering when he visited. Mary didn't want no part of it. She loved me, you see, but she worried Miss Elinor might have got the wrong idea." Poirot leaned forward. "And did Mary speak of Nurse Hopkins?" Ted's jaw tightened. "She didn't trust her. Said Hopkins was always watching, listening. Once, Mary caught her rifling through Mrs. Wellman's papers. Hopkins laughed it off, said she was tidying, but Mary didn't buy it. She thought Hopkins was up to something." Poirot's fingers drummed on his cane. "And the day of the lunch, did Mary mention anything unusual?" "She said the tea tasted odd," Ted recalled, his voice low, bitter, like, "but she didn't want to make a fuss. I should have made her leave, Mr. Poirot. I should have." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. Poirot placed a hand on Ted's shoulder. "You could not have known, mon ami, but your words, they helped me see the truth." He rose, his mind alight with the bitter tea, the rifled papers, the watchful nurse. Hopkins was no mere bystander. She was a player in this deadly game. Back at Hunterbury, Poirot wandered the grounds, his eyes drawn to the greenhouse, where the zephyr and druin roses bloomed. Horlick, the gardener, was pruning nearby, his weathered hands deft with the shears. Poirot approached, his demeanor disarming. "Monsieur Horlick, a moment, if you please. These roses, they are magnificent. Tell me, have you ever seen Nurse Hopkins tending them?" Horlick snorted, wiping sweat from his brow. Nah, she's no gardener. Said she got scratched once, but I never saw her near the roses. The zephyrin's don't have thorns, anyhow. She must have been talking nonsense." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And did you notice anything unusual around the time of Mrs. Wellman's death?" Horlick hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I didn't like to say, but I saw Hopkins coming out of the lodge late one night, before Mrs. Wellman passed. Looked shifty, she did, carrying a small bag, like she didn't want no one to see." Poirot's heart quickened. The lodge where Mary lived with her father, Ephraim Gerrard. A bag, a rifled desk, a missing morphine tube. The threads were weaving together, but the pattern was not yet clear. He thanked Horlick and made his way to the lodge, a squat stone building at the edge of the estate. Inside, the air was stale, the furniture covered in dust sheets. Poirot's eyes scanned the room, settling on a small desk in the corner. He opened the drawers, finding little of note, until he uncovered a torn scrap of paper, its edges jagged. It was a pharmaceutical label, the text partially legible. Morphine, hydro, the rest was missing, but Poirot's pulse raced. Was it morphine, as the prosecution claimed, or something else entirely? He pocketed the label and stepped outside, the evening sky darkening with the promise of rain. His mind churned with questions. Hopkins' guarded demeanor, her convenient scratch, her presence at the lodge, it all pointed to a woman with secrets. But was she the mastermind, or a pawn in a larger scheme? And Elinor, her restraint, her pain, her love for Roddy, could she truly be innocent, or was her calm a mask for guilt? That evening, Poirot sat in his rented room at the village inn, the label spread out on the table before him. He sipped at tisane, his grey cells working overtime. The label was a puzzle piece, but its meaning was elusive. Morphine, perhaps, but the tear suggested tampering. He recalled Hopkins' pale face during the lunch, her solitude in the kitchen, her quickness to blame Elinor. And then there was Ted's revelation, Mary's unease, the bitter tea, the rifled papers. Hopkins was at the center of it all, her actions too deliberate to be coincidence. Poirot leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "The mask of innocence," he murmured. "It is worn by many, but it is the cracks that reveal the truth." He thought of Elinor, her stoic face in the courtroom, her love for Roddy, a wound she hid from the world. Was she a victim of Hopkins' machinations, or had her passion driven her to murder? And the label, could it hold the key to unraveling the poison's true path? As the rain began to fall outside, Poirot resolved to dig deeper. The next day, he would return to the courtroom, where the torn label would take center stage. But for now, he closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the rain guide his thoughts. The truth was close, hidden in the shadows of deception, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until it was brought to light. Chapter 5. Secrets of the Lodge. The sun hung low over the rolling hills of Maidensford, casting long shadows across the cobblestone path leading to the lodge where Mary Gerrard had lived her final days. Hercule Poirot, his polished shoes crunching softly against the gravel, paused to survey the modest stone building nestled among overgrown hawthorns. Its ivy-clad walls seemed to whisper secrets, as if the very stones knew more than they let on. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fading summer blooms, a fitting backdrop for the tangled web of deception Poirot was determined to unravel. Inside, the lodge was a study in contrasts, humble yet tidy, with polished wooden floors and faded lace curtains that spoke of care despite limited means. Poirot's keen eyes scanned the room, noting the worn armchair by the hearth, a small bookshelf stuffed with gardening manuals, and a single photograph framed in silver, a young Mary Gerrard, her smile radiant, standing beside an older man with a weathered face. Ephraim Bob Gerrard, her legal father. The image stirred Poirot's curiosity, for it hinted at a bond that might hold the key to the mystery. Dr. Peter Lord, who had accompanied Poirot, shifted uncomfortably by the door. His boyish face, usually open and earnest, was clouded with worry. "Do you really think this place holds answers, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked, his voice low. "It's just the lodge. Mary lived here with her father, nothing more." Poirot's mustache twitched as he turned, his eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of intuition. Mon cher docteur, it is not the place itself but the stories it shelters. The lodge, it is like a locked diary, simple on the outside, but within, secrets wait to be read. And I, Hercule Poirot, am an excellent reader." Peter nodded, though his skepticism lingered. He had seen Poirot's methods before, but the weight of Elinor Carlisle's trial pressed heavily on him. Every moment spent here felt like a gamble against time. Yet Poirot moved with deliberate calm, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of a small oak desk tucked in the corner. He opened a drawer, revealing a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. Among them was a letter, its edges yellowed, the handwriting elegant but shaky. "This," Poirot said, holding the letter aloft, "is where we begin." The letter, addressed to Bob Gerrard, was signed by his late wife, Elisa. Its contents were brief but seismic. "Mary is our daughter, our pride. Raise her well, as we promised." The words seemed straightforward, yet Poirot's brow furrowed. "Our daughter," he murmured. "But is it so simple? The village, it speaks in whispers, and those whispers tell a different tale." Peter leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "Village gossip." "Precisement," Poirot replied, slipping the letter into his pocket. "We must visit someone who knows the pulse of Maidensford, someone whose tongue is as sharp as her memory." The path to Mrs. Slattery's cottage wound through a cluster of ancient oaks, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that dappled the ground with light and shadow. Mrs. Slattery, a wiry woman in her late 60s, with eyes like polished flint, welcomed Poirot and Peter with a mix of wariness and intrigue. Her parlour was a riot of colour-crocheted doilies, vibrant cushions, and a kettle whistling merrily on the stove. She poured tea into chipped porcelain cups, her movements brisk but precise. "So the famous Hercule Poirot comes to my humble door," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I reckon it's about poor Mary Gerrard and that wretched trial. Elinor Carlisle didn't do it, if you ask me. Too refined, that one, for poison." Poirot inclined his head, accepting the tea with a polite nod. "Madame Slattery, your reputation as the keeper of Maidensford stories precedes you. I seek the truth about Mary Gerrard's origins. The letter from Eliza Gerrard claims Mary as her daughter, but there are suggestions otherwise." Mrs. Slattery's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're sniffing the right trail, monsieur. That letter. Theft. Eliza Gerrard was a good woman, but she and Bob couldn't have children. Everyone knew it. Mary wasn't theirs by blood, though they raised her as their own." Peter's cup clinked against its saucer. "Then whose child was she?" Mrs. Slattery glanced toward the window, as if ensuring no one lingered outside. "Laura Wellman," she said at last. "The Lady of Hunterbury herself. Word is, she had a dalliance years ago with Sir Lewis Rycroft, that dashing rogue who died in the war. Mary was the result, a secret kept tighter than a miser's purse. Eliza and Bob took her in, raised her as their own, with Laura's blessing and coin to ease the way." Poirot's fingers steepled beneath his chin, his mind racing. "And who else knew of this?" "Madame Few. At first," Mrs. Slattery replied, "but secrets don't stay buried in Maidensford. Nurse Hopkins, she'd have caught wind of it, always poking her nose where it didn't belong. That one. And Mary herself, she started asking questions when she got older. Wanted to know why Laura was so kind to her, sending her to school abroad and all." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And did Mary confront anyone about her parentage?" Mrs. Slattery shrugged, stirring her tea with a silver spoon. "Not that I heard, but she was a sharp girl. If she suspected, she'd have kept it close. Didn't trust Nurse Hopkins, I'll tell you that. Saw her whispering with Hopkins once, near the lodge, looking like they'd swallowed a lemon apiece." Peter frowned, his hands clenching. "If Mary was Laura's daughter, that changes everything. Elinor inherited Hunterbury because Laura died without a will. If Mary was a legitimate heir..." "Precisement," Poirot interjected. "The motive shifts. It is no longer just a matter of jealousy over a broken engagement. It is inheritance of fortune that could tempt even the most virtuous heart." The revelation hung heavy as Poirot and Peter returned to the lodge. The afternoon sun now dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. Poirot insisted on examining Mary's room, a small space adorned with simple furnishings, a narrow bed, a wardrobe, and a writing desk cluttered with books and trinkets. Among them was a locked diary, its leather cover worn but intact. With Peter's reluctant approval, Poirot deftly picked the lock using a paper skill he waved off with a modest, "One learns many things in the pursuit of truth." The diary's pages were filled with Mary's neat handwriting, chronicling her thoughts and dreams. Entries spoke of her gratitude for Laura Wellman's generosity, her unease about Roddy Wellman's attentions, and her growing suspicion about her origins. One passage, dated a month before her death, stood out. "Nurse H asked me about Mother's letters today. She seemed too interested, almost angry when I said I hadn't read them all. Why does she care? I don't trust her eyes, they see too much." Poirot closed the diary, his expression grave. Mary was no fool. She sensed danger, but she did not know its shape. Nurse Hopkins, I think, knew more than she let on. Peter paced, his frustration mounting. But why would Hopkins care about Mary's parentage? She's just a nurse, not part of the family. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Is she, mon ami? Or does she have a stake we have not yet seen? The letter from Eliza, the whispers of Laura's secret, the questions Mary asked, they all point to a truth Nurse Hopkins wished to control. The investigation took a new turn as Poirot sought out Ted Bigland, the villager who had spoken of Mary's unease about Roddy. Ted, a lanky young man with sun-bleached hair and calloused hands, was tending sheep in a field near the village. He greeted Poirot with a nod, wiping sweat from his brow as he leaned against a weathered fence. Mary was a good lass, Ted said, his voice tinged with sorrow. Didn't deserve what happened. She told me once she felt like a pawn in someone else's game. Said Nurse Hopkins was always hovering, asking about her plans. Her letters made her skin crawl. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Did Mary mention anything specific about Nurse Hopkins' questions? Ted scratched his chin, thinking. She said Hopkins asked about old papers in the lodge letters, documents, that sort of thing. Mary thought it odd, 'cause Hopkins never seemed the sentimental type. Once, she caught Hopkins rummaging in Bob's desk when she thought no one was home. Poirot's mustache quivered with excitement. Rummaging, you say? And did Mary confront her? Aye, she did, Ted replied. Hopkins laughed it off, said she was looking for a recipe or some such nonsense, but Mary didn't buy it. Said Hopkins had a look in her eye like a fox in a henhouse. Back at the lodge, Poirot sifted through Bob Gerrard's papers once more, his gloved hands moving with surgical precision. Among the clutter of bills and receipts, he found a second letter. This one, unsigned but written in a different hand, more deliberate. It read, "Keep her close but tell her nothing. The truth would ruin everything." The paper bore a faint watermark, one Poirot recognized from the Hunterbury Estate's stationery. "This," he said to Peter, "is no coincidence. Someone at Hunterbury knew of Mary's origins and wished to keep them hidden. But why? And how does Nurse Hopkins fit into this puzzle?" Peter's face was pale. "You think Hopkins was involved in Laura's death too, not just Mary's?" Poirot's gaze was steady. "It is possible, mon ami. Laura Wellman's death without a will left Elinor with everything and Mary with nothing. If Mary was Laura's daughter, and if someone knew this, the stakes were higher than a lover's quarrel. We must learn more about Nurse Hopkins' past, her connections to the Gerrards and to Hunterbury." The day drew to a close with Poirot and Peter seated in the lodge's small parlour, the fire crackling softly as they reviewed their findings. Poirot's notebook was filled with meticulous notes. The letter from Eliza, Mrs. Slattery's gossip, Mary's diary, Ted's account, and the mysterious unsigned note. Each piece was a thread in a tapestry of deception, and Poirot was determined to weave them together. "Dr. Lord," Poirot said, his voice calm but resolute, "we have uncovered a secret that changes the shape of this case. Mary Gerrard was no mere villager's daughter. She was the heir to a fortune, a truth hidden by those who stood to gain from her ignorance. Nurse Hopkins, I suspect, is not merely a bystander. Her questions, her presence, her knowledge, they point to a woman with a purpose." Peter leaned forward, his eyes bright with hope. "Then Elinor, she's innocent. This proves it, doesn't it?" Poirot raised a cautionary hand. "Not yet, mon ami. We have a motive, a secret, and a suspect. But we need proof that will stand in the courtroom. Tomorrow, we dig deeper into Nurse Hopkins' past. There is a connection, a thread that ties her to this tragedy, and I, Hercule Poirot, will find it." As the firelight flickered, casting shadows across the lodge's walls, the weight of Mary's secret settled over them. The truth was close, but it was cloaked in danger, and Poirot knew that unmasking it would require every ounce of his cunning. The lodge, once a haven, now felt like a stage where a deadly drama had played out, a drama Poirot was determined to bring to its final act. Chapter 6. The courtroom's echoes. The air in the assize courtroom was thick with anticipation, a palpable weight that pressed against the oak-paneled walls and settled into the creases of every observer's brow. The chamber, with its high ceilings and austere furnishings, seemed to hum with the collective breath of the spectators, their whispers weaving a tapestry of doubt, hope, and morbid curiosity. Elinor Carlisle sat in the dock, her posture rigid yet composed, her pale hands folded neatly in her lap. Her auburn hair, swept back in a simple chignon, caught the dim light filtering through the courtroom's tall windows, giving her an almost ethereal glow. To the untrained eye, she was the picture of calm innocence, but to Hercule Poirot, seated in the gallery with his sharp eyes fixed upon her, she was a puzzle wrapped in a paradox. Poirot's mustache twitched slightly as he leaned forward, his gloved hands resting on the polished railing. The trial had reached a critical juncture, and the defense was about to call its witnesses. The prosecution had painted a damning portrait of Elinor as a woman scorned, driven by jealousy to poison her romantic rival, Mary Gerrard, with a lethal dose of morphine during a fateful lunch at Hunterbury. The evidence, circumstantial yet compelling, had swayed the jury's mood, their faces a gallery of grim certainty. Yet Poirot, ever the skeptic of surface truths, sensed a deeper current beneath the case's polished narrative. The anonymous letter that had first drawn him into the investigation lingered in his mind, its cryptic warning of someone who won't stop at anything, suggesting a mind far more cunning than Elinor's. The clerk's voice cut through the murmur, sharp and authoritative. "The defense calls Monsieur Hercule Poirot." A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Heads turned, eyes widened, and the spectators' whispers grew into a low buzz. Poirot rose, his small, fastidious figure cutting in ink silhouette against the grandeur of the court. He adjusted his tie with a precise flick of his fingers and descended to the witness stand. His steps measured, his expression serene yet piercing. The judge, a stern man with a face like weathered granite, peered over his spectacles, his curiosity piqued by the appearance of the famed detective. "Monsieur Poirot," began Mr. Seddon, the defense counsel, his voice smooth yet edged with urgency, "you have been investigating the circumstances surrounding the death of Mary Gerrard, have you not?" "Oui, c'est vrai," Poirot replied, his voice clear and accented, carrying the weight of his conviction. "I have examined the events at Hunterbury with the utmost care, and I have uncovered certain inconsistencies that demand attention." The courtroom leaned forward as one. Elinor's eyes, previously fixed on some distant point, flickered toward Poirot, a spark of hope igniting within their depths. Dr. Peter Lord, seated near the front, gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles whitening. He had placed his faith in Poirot, and now the moment had come to see if that faith would bear fruit. Seddon paced before the witness stand, his robe swishing softly. "Could you share with the court one such inconsistency, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on the jury before returning to Seddon. "Mais, oui. Let us consider the matter of the torn pharmaceutical label found among the debris at Hunterbury. The prosecution has suggested it was a label for morphine, implicating Mademoiselle Carlisle in the poisoning of Mary Gerrard. But I have examined this label closely, and I submit to you that it is not for morphine at all. It is, in fact, a label for apomorphine hydrochloride." A collective gasp rose from the gallery. The judge's gavel rapped sharply, silencing the outburst. "Order," he barked, his eyes narrowing as he turned to explain. "Monsieur Poirot, what is this apomorphine, and why does it matter?" Poirot's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, though his eyes remained steely. "Apomorphine hydrochloride, my lord, is not a poison but an emetic substance that induces vomiting. Its presence in this case suggests a possibility most intriguing, that someone at the fatal lunch at Hunterbury took this substance deliberately to expel the contents of their stomach, thereby avoiding the effects of any poison that may have been ingested." The courtroom erupted into murmurs once more, and the judge's gavel fell again. Seddon seized the moment, his voice rising with calculated drama. "Are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot, that someone other than my client could have orchestrated this tragedy?" "I suggest, Monsieur Seddon, that the truth is not as simple as the prosecution would have us believe," Poirot replied, his tone measured, yet laced with an undercurrent of challenge. "The label's presence raises questions. Who had access? to apomorphine, who might have had reason to protect themselves from the poison while ensuring another's demise. The prosecution counsel, Mr. Hemming, rose swiftly, his face flushed with indignation. "Objection, my lord. This is mere speculation, designed to confuse the jury. There is no evidence that apomorphine was used at the lunch, nor that anyone other than the defendant had motive or opportunity." The judge's gaze shifted to Poirot, his expression unreadable. "Monsieur Poirot, can you substantiate this claim with evidence?" Poirot inclined his head. "I can, my lord. The label was found in the kitchen at Hunterbury, near the sink where Nurse Jessie Hopkins was observed washing dishes alone after the lunch. Her behavior, as reported by witnesses, was peculiar. She appeared pale, unsteady, and insisted on cleaning the dishes herself. These are symptoms consistent with the effects of apomorphine, which, while effective, can cause discomfort." Hemming's eyes narrowed. "And yet, Monsieur Poirot, you have no proof that Nurse Hopkins administered this substance to herself. This is conjecture, not fact." Poirot's smile widened, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Not conjecture, Monsieur Hemming, but a hypothesis supported by the facts. The label, the symptoms, the timing all point to a deliberate act, and I have further inquiries in progress that may illuminate Nurse Hopkins' role more clearly." The judge leaned forward, his voice sharp. "What inquiries, Monsieur Poirot? The court requires specifics, not theatrics." Poirot's expression remained unruffled. "I have requested the testimony of certain individuals from New Zealand, acquaintances of Nurse Hopkins from her time there. Their statements, which I expect to arrive imminently, may shed light on her character and past actions. Until then, I ask the court to consider the apomorphine label as evidence of a possible alternative narrative, one that does not necessarily point to Mademoiselle Carlisle." The courtroom buzzed with excitement, the spectators unable to contain their whispers. Elinor's hands tightened in her lap, her breath catching as she absorbed Poirot's words. Peter Lord's face broke into a cautious smile, his faith in Poirot reaffirmed. The judge, however, remained stern, his gaze boring into Poirot. "Very well," the judge said at last. "The court will allow this testimony to be considered, pending the arrival of these witnesses. But I caution you, Monsieur Poirot, to avoid speculation without concrete evidence. The jury will disregard any unproven assertions for now." Poirot bowed slightly. "Merci, my lord. I assure you, the truth will reveal itself in due course." As Poirot stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom seemed to exhale, the tension shifting from suffocating to electric. Seddon called the next witness, a young maid from Hunterbury named Beatrice, whose nervous demeanor contrasted sharply with Poirot's calm authority. Beatrice, barely 19, clutched her hands tightly as she took the stand, her eyes darting toward Elinor with a mix of pity and fear. "Miss Beatrice," Seddon began gently, "you were present at Hunterbury on the day of Mary's death. Can you describe what you saw in the kitchen after the lunch?" Beatrice swallowed hard, her voice trembling. I saw Nurse Hopkins washing the dishes, sir. She was alone, like Monsieur Poirot said. She looked poorly, like she was going to be sick. I offered to help, but she snapped at me, told me to leave her be." Seddon nodded encouragingly. "And did you notice anything unusual about the dishes or the kitchen?" Beatrice hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the jury. "There was a bit of paper on the counter, sir. It looked like it had been torn, with some writing on it. I didn't read it, but it was near the sink where Nurse Hopkins was working." Seddon's eyes gleamed. "Would you say it resembled the pharmaceutical label Monsieur Poirot described?" I suppose it could have, sir," Beatrice stammered. "It was small, like something from a medicine bottle." Hemming rose to cross-examine, his tone sharp. "Miss Beatrice, can you confirm the exact nature of this paper? Was it indeed a label for apomorphine, or are you merely echoing Monsieur Poirot's suggestion?" Beatrice flushed, her voice faltering. "I don't know, sir. I didn't look closely. It was just there." Hemming smirked, turning to the jury. "A torn piece of paper, vaguely described, proves nothing. This is a distraction, nothing more." But the seed had been planted. The jury's faces, once resolute in their condemnation of Elinor, now showed flickers of doubt. Poirot, back in the gallery, watched with quiet satisfaction, his mind already racing ahead to the next piece of the puzzle. The apomorphine label was a crack in the prosecution's case, a chink through which the light of truth could begin to shine. But he knew the real battle lay ahead. With Nurse Hopkins past, and the secrets she guarded. As the court adjourned for the day, Poirot lingered in the gallery, observing the crowd's dispersal. Elinor was led back to her cell, her expression unreadable, but her eyes briefly meeting Poirot's with a silent plea. Peter Lord approached, his face alight with cautious optimism. "You've done it, Poirot," he said, his voice low but fervent. "That label, it's a game-changer, isn't it?" Poirot's moustache twitched. "It is a beginning, Dr. Lord, but the game, as you call it, is far from over. Nurse Hopkins is a woman of many masks, and I suspect she has worn them for years. We must uncover what lies beneath." Lord nodded, his jaw tightening. "What about these New Zealand witnesses? Can they really prove anything?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. "They will provide the context, mon ami. The past has a way of illuminating the present. Nurse Hopkins' history may hold the key to her actions at Hunterbury." As they stepped into the cool evening air outside the courthouse, Poirot's mind churned with possibilities. The apomorphine label was a masterstroke, but it was only the beginning. He recalled the gardener Horlick's mention of the thornless Zephyrin Druin rose, the discrepancy in Nurse Hopkins' story about her wrist, and the whispers of Mary Gerrard's true parentage. Each clue was a thread in a tapestry of deception, and Poirot was determined to weave them together. The streets of London buzzed with life as Poirot and Lord made their way to a nearby tea-room, a haven of quiet amidst the city's clamour. Over steaming cups of Earl Grey, Poirot shared his next steps. "We must delve deeper into Nurse Hopkins' time in New Zealand," he said, his voice low. "Her past there is not as innocent as she would have us believe. I have sent cables to contacts in Auckland, and I expect their replies soon. They may reveal a pattern of behaviour exploitation, perhaps, or manipulation of those in her care." Lord frowned, stirring his tea absently. "You think she's done this before? Poisoned someone for gain?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "It is possible. The apomorphine suggests a mind that plans meticulously, one that anticipates consequences and prepares accordingly. Such a mind does not act on impulse, it has experience." Lord leaned back, his expression troubled. "But why Mary Gerrard? If Elinor's the one with the inheritance, why target Mary?" Poirot sipped his tea, his gaze distant. "That, mon ami, is the question. Mary Gerrard was no ordinary victim. The rumours of her parentage, Laura Wellman's illegitimate daughter, with Sir Lewis Rycliffe, suggests a motive tied to inheritance. If Mary was indeed Laura's heir, her death would secure the fortune for another. Nurse Hopkins, with her intimate knowledge of the Wellman household, may have seen an opportunity." Lord's eyes widened. "You think Hopkins knew about Mary's parentage?" "I am certain of it," Poirot said firmly. "Her connection to the Gerrards, her presence at Hunterbury, her guarded demeanour all point to a woman who knows more than she reveals. The anonymous letter, I suspect, was her own creation, designed to cast suspicion on Elinor and Roddy while diverting attention from herself." Lord shook his head, marvelling. "It's diabolical, but how do we prove it?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "With patience, mon ami, and the little grey cells. The witnesses from New Zealand will provide the first piece. Then, we must confront the thornless rose, the lie that betrays Nurse Hopkins' deception. And finally, we must unravel the truth of the fatal lunch, where the poison was administered not in the sandwiches, as the prosecution claims, but in the tea, a detail only the true culprit would know." As the tea-room's clock struck 7, Poirot rose, his movements brisk. "Come, Dr. Lord, we have work to do. The truth awaits, and it will not elude Hercule Poirot." The evening deepened into night, and Poirot's mind remained alight with the case's intricacies. Back at his flat, he pored over his notes, the apomorphine label, a tangible link to the killer's cunning. He sketched a timeline of the lunch at Hunterbury, mapping out the movements of Elinor, Mary, and Nurse Hopkins. The sandwiches, shared by all three, were an unlikely vehicle, for the poison morphine would have affected them all. The tea, however, drunk only by Mary and Hopkins, was the key. Hopkins' pallor, her solitude in the kitchen, her insistence on washing the dishes, it all pointed to a calculated act of self-preservation. Poirot's thoughts drifted to the courtroom, where the jury's faces had shifted from certainty to uncertainty. The apomorphine revelation had done its work, planting doubt where none had existed. But doubt alone was not enough. To save Elinor, Poirot needed proof, refutable, unassailable proof, that would expose Nurse Hopkins as the architect. of Mary's death, a knock at the door interrupted his reverie. A telegram, delivered by a breathless courier, bore the seal of his contact in Auckland. Poirot tore it open, his eyes scanning the words with fierce intensity. The message was brief but damning. Nurse Jessie Hopkins, known in New Zealand as Jessica Harper, had been implicated in a scandal involving the suspicious death of an elderly patient under her care. No charges had been filed, but the patient's family had accused her of manipulating the will to her advantage. The pattern was unmistakable. Poirot's lips curved into a triumphant smile. "Voila," he murmured. "The past speaks, and the truth draws near." He penned a response, requesting the witnesses' swift travel to London. Their testimony would be the cornerstone of his case, the lever to pry open Nurse Hopkins' carefully constructed facade. But he knew the courtroom would be a battlefield, with Hemming ready to challenge every word. Poirot would need more than testimony. He would need the final, irrefutable clue that tied Hopkins to the poison dot. The next morning, Poirot returned to the courtroom, his demeanor as polished as ever, but his mind razor-sharp. The defense called Mrs. Slattery, the village gossip whose earlier whispers had hinted at Mary's true parentage. Her testimony was a masterclass in controlled chaos, her words tumbling out in a mix of indignation and relish. Everyone knew Laura Wellman was sweet on Sir Lewis Rickroft, Mrs. Slattery declared, her voice carrying to the back of the room. And Mary Gerrard, well, she wasn't Bob Gerrard's daughter, not by blood. Eliza Gerrard, rest her soul, took the secret to her grave, but Laura treated Mary like her own. Nurse Hopkins knew it too. She was always hovering, asking questions, poking her nose where it didn't belong. Said and seized the opportunity. "Mrs. Slattery, are you suggesting Nurse Hopkins was aware of Mary Gerrard's connection to Laura Wellman?" "Oh, aye," Mrs. Slattery said, nodding vigorously. She'd talked to Eliza Gerrard for hours, back when Eliza was alive. Always asking about Mary, about Laura's will. She had a way of getting under your skin, that one. Hemming's cross-examination was ruthless, dismissing Mrs. Slattery as a purveyor of hearsay, but the damage was done. The jury's eyes darted toward Nurse Hopkins, who sat in the gallery with a face like stone, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Poirot watched her closely, noting the faint tremor in her fingers, the slight tightening of her jaw. She was not as unshakable as she appeared. As the day wore on, the defense called additional witnesses, servants, neighbors, even the local chemist who had supplied Hunterbury with medical supplies. Each added a fragment to the puzzle, reinforcing Poirot's narrative of doubt. The chemist confirmed that apomorphine was not commonly stocked but could have been obtained by someone with medical knowledge, like Nurse Hopkins. A footman recalled seeing Hopkins linger near the tea tray before the lunch, her movements furtive. By the time the court adjourned, the prosecution's case was fraying at the edges. Poirot stepped into the corridor, where Peter Lord was waiting, his face alight with hope. "You're turning the tide," Lord said, gripping Poirot's arm. "The jury's wavering, I can see it." Poirot's expression was cautious. "We have made progress, mon ami, but the battle is not won. Nurse Hopkins is clever, and she will not surrender easily. We must be prepared for her counterattack." Lord frowned. Counterattack? What could she do? Poirot's eyes darkened. She may attempt to shift the blame, to weave a new narrative that protects her, but she underestimates Hercule Poirot. The truth is like a cypress tree, strong, enduring, and impossible to uproot once it takes hold. As they parted ways, Poirot's mind returned to the thornless rose, the Zephyrin Druin that had betrayed Hopkins' lie. It was a small clue, but in Poirot's hands, small clues became mighty weapons. He resolved to revisit Hunterbury, to examine the rose garden himself, to confirm the absence of thorns that would seal Hopkins' fate. Chapter 7. The quickness of air. The courtroom in Maidensford buzzed with an electric tension, its oak-panelled walls seeming to lean inward, as if straining to hear the next revelation. Hercule Poirot sat in the gallery, his small, immaculate figure, a stark contrast to the restless crowd. His eyes, sharp as a falcon's, darted between the witnesses, the judge, and the accused Elinor Carlisle, whose serene composure belied the weight of a murder charge. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that precedes a storm, and Poirot knew that the case was about to shift on its axis. He had a plan, one that relied on what he called the quickness of air, the swift, invisible currents that could carry truth from distant shores to this very room. The morning had begun with a seemingly routine procession of witnesses, each adding brushstrokes to the prosecution's portrait of Elinor as a jealous, calculating killer. The morphine, the sandwiches, the tea all pointed to her, or so it seemed. But Poirot's mind was elsewhere, piecing together fragments from Hunterbury. The estate where Mary Gerrard had met her untimely end. The torn label, the thornless rose, Nurse Hopkins' guarded demeanor. These were not mere details, but threads in a tapestry of deception. And now, Poirot was ready to pull a thread that would unravel the entire design. He leaned toward Dr. Peter Lord, the young physician whose devotion to Elinor was as evident as his unease in the courtroom's glare. "Monsieur Lord Poirot," murmured, his voice low but resonant, "today, we shall see how swiftly the truth can travel. I have summoned voices from across the seas, and they will speak of matters most illuminating." Peter's brow furrowed, his earnest face a canvas of hope and doubt. Voices from where, Poirot? And how can they help Elinor? Poirot's mustache twitched, a faint smile playing beneath it. "Patience, mon ami. The quickness of air has brought them here, and their words will cast light where shadows have lingered too long." The bailiff's call interrupted their exchange. "The court calls Miss Margaret Lichfield and Mr. Thomas Brunt." A murmur rippled through the crowd as two figures entered, their presence an anomaly in the provincial courtroom. Margaret Lichfield was a wiry woman in her late 50s, her grey hair pulled into a severe bun, her eyes darting with the alertness of someone accustomed to scrutiny. Thomas Brunt, by contrast, was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, his hands calloused. From years of labour, their attire simple but slightly outdated hinted at a long journey, and their accents, when they spoke, confirmed it. New Zealand, a world away. The judge, Sir Edwin Montague, adjusted his spectacles, his expression one of cautious curiosity. "Mr. Poirot, I understand these witnesses have been brought at your request. Their relevance to the case had better be clear." Poirot rose, his movements deliberate, his black patterned leather shoes gleaming under the courtroom's harsh lights. "My lord, these witnesses will illuminate the character and past actions of Nurse Jessie Hopkins, a key figure in the tragedy at Hunterbury. Their testimony will demonstrate that the truth, like air, moves swiftly and cannot be contained." The prosecution's counsel, Mr. Gerald Hawes, snorted audibly. "This is highly irregular, my lord. Witnesses from New Zealand. This smacks of theatrics, not evidence." Sir Edwin's gavel rapped sharply. "Mr. Hawes, you will have your chance to cross-examine. Mr. Poirot, proceed." Poirot inclined his head, then turned to Margaret Lichfield, who stood in the witness box with the poise of someone who had faced worse than a courtroom scrutiny. "Mademoiselle Lichfield," he began, his voice smooth as polished oak, "you were acquainted with Nurse Jessie Hopkins in Auckland, were you not?" Margaret nodded, her lips pursed. "Yes, sir. One knew her for nigh on 10 years, from 15 to 25. She was a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, where I was matron." "And what was her reputation among her colleagues?" Margaret's eyes narrowed, as if peering into a memory she'd rather forget. "Jessie was clever, no doubt. Too clever, some said. She had a way of getting close to patients' wealthy ones, mind you, always offering extra care, staying late, bringing little gifts. But there was talk that she wasn't as selfless as she seemed." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Talk of what nature, mademoiselle?" "She'd cozy up to patients with money, especially those without close kin. There was an old gentleman, Mr. Herreby, who left her a tidy sum in his will. Then there was Mrs. Caulfield, a widow with a fine estate. Jessie nursed her through her last days, and wouldn't you know, a new will appeared, naming Jessie as beneficiary, caused a right scandal when the family contested it." The courtroom stirred, whispers rising like a sudden breeze. Poirot raised a hand, silencing the crowd with the authority of his presence. "And did you witness any specific incident that confirmed these suspicions?" Margaret hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "I did. One night, I caught Jessie in Mrs. Caulfield's room, holding a syringe. She claimed it was morphine for pain, but the dosage, it was too high. I reported it to the head physician, and Jessie was reprimanded. She left St. Mary's soon after, but not before whispering to me that I'd regret crossing her." The gallery erupted in murmurs, and Sir Edwin's gavel fell again. Poirot turned to Thomas Brunt, who shifted uncomfortably in the witness box, his large hands gripping the rail. "Monsieur Brunt, you knew Nurse Hopkins in a different capacity." Thomas nodded, his voice a low rumble. I was groundskeeper at the Caulfield estate in 23. Jessie was there often, tending to Mrs. Caulfield. I saw things that didn't sit right, such as Poirot prompted, his eyes glinting. She'd linger in the study, going through papers, when she thought no one was watching. Once, I saw her slip a document into her bag, a legal-looking one, with seals. I told the butler, but Jessie had a way of talking herself out of trouble. Said it was a medical record, but I didn't believe her. Not long after, Mrs. Caulfield died, and that will turned up, leaving Jessie a fortune. Poirot's expression remained impassive, but his mind was a whirlwind of connections. Nurse Hopkins' past was not merely a backdrop but a blueprint for her actions at Hunterbury. He turned to the jury, his voice rising with quiet intensity. Mesdames et messieurs, you have heard of Nurse Hopkins' history, a pattern of exploiting trust, manipulating wills, and perhaps hastening deaths. This is not mere coincidence but a design, one that we see repeated in the tragedy of Mary Gerrard. The prosecution objected, but Sir Edwin allowed Poirot to continue, his curiosity piqued. Poirot's next question was directed at both witnesses. Did Nurse Hopkins ever mention a connection to England, perhaps to the village of Maidensford or the Wellman family? Margaret's eyes widened slightly. She did, once. Said she had a sister in England, in a village near London. Didn't say the name, but she mentioned a grand estate and a lady who'd been kind to her family. Said she'd visit one day, maybe settle old scores. Thomas nodded. Aye, she talked of England too. Said she'd been wronged there once, by someone high and mighty. Never gave details, but her eye, they'd go cold when she spoke of it. Poirot stepped back, letting the weight of their words settle over the courtroom. The pieces were falling into place, but one crucial link remained. The torn label from Hunterbury, marked apomorphine hydrochloride. He turned to Dr. Lord, who had been summoned to the stand as an expert witness. Dr. Lord, Poirot began, "You are familiar with the properties of apomorphine hydrochloride, are you not?" Peter nodded, his voice steady despite the scrutiny. "Yes, it's an emetic, used to induce vomiting. It's derived from morphine but has a very different effect. It's not a poison in the way morphine is. It clears the stomach rather than sedates, and if someone were to ingest morphine, then quickly administer apomorphine to themselves, what would happen?" Peter's eyes lit with understanding. "They'd vomit, likely expelling the morphine before it could take effect. It would be a way to avoid poisoning while others were not so fortunate." The courtroom gasped, the implication clear. Poirot pressed on. "And the mark on Nurse Hopkins' wrist, which she attributed to a rose thorn, it had been caused by a needle, perhaps from a self-administered injection." Peter hesitated, then nodded. "It's possible. A small puncture could resemble a thorn prick, especially if someone wanted to disguise it." Poirot turned to the jury, his voice now a blade cutting through the fog of doubt. "Consider mes amis, the lunch, at Hunterbury. 3 women, Miss Carlisle, Miss Gerrard, and Nurse Hopkins, partake of sandwiches. All survive this meal, but the tea, prepared by Nurse Hopkins, is consumed only by herself and Miss Gerrard. Miss Gerrard dies, poisoned by morphine. Nurse Hopkins, however, is seen afterward, pale and retreating to the kitchen alone. Why? Because she injected herself with apomorphine, ensuring her survival while Mary Gerrard succumbed." The gallery was a storm of whispers now, and even Mr. Hawes looked unsettled. Poirot continued, his voice rising to a crescendo. "Nurse Hopkins, with her history of manipulating the vulnerable, saw an opportunity at Hunterbury. She knew of Mary Gerrard's connection to Laura Wellman, perhaps her true parentage. By eliminating Mary, she could secure a claim to the Wellman fortune, either through blackmail or a forged will. The anonymous letter accusing Elinor was her creation, a smokescreen to divert suspicion." Sir Edwin leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Mr. Poirot, these are grave accusations. Do you have evidence to support this theory?" Poirot's smile was serene, but his eyes burned with certainty. "My lord, the evidence lies in the details. The thornless rose, the torn label, the witnesses who have crossed oceans to speak, and there is more. I have requested an analysis of the teapot used at Hunterbury. I believe it will reveal traces of apomorphine, confirming that Nurse Hopkins tampered with the tea." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words sinking in. Elinor Carlisle, sitting in the dock, allowed a single tear to slip down her cheek, her stoic mask cracking for the first time. Peter Lord's hand tightened on the rail, his hope rekindled. The jury exchanged glances, their confidence in the prosecution's case shaken. As the session adjourned for the day, Poirot stepped outside into the crisp Maidensford air, the sky streaked with the gold of late afternoon. Peter joined him, his voice trembling with gratitude. "Poirot, if what you say is true, you've saved her. But how did you know to bring those witnesses from New Zealand?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "The quickness of air, mon ami, a telegram to an old friend in Auckland, a few inquiries, and the truth began to take flight. Nurse Hopkins' past could not remain buried, not when Hercule Poirot seeks it out." "But the teapot analysis," Peter pressed. "When will we know?" "Tomorrow, perhaps," Poirot replied. "But the seeds of doubt are sown. The jury sees now that the case is not as simple as it seems. Nurse Hopkins' facade is crumbling, and soon the truth will stand bare." As they walked toward the inn where Poirot was staying, the detective's mind was already racing ahead. The rose, the label, the witnesses, they were all pieces of a puzzle, but the final picture was not yet complete. Nurse Hopkins was cunning, her motives rooted in greed and perhaps a deeper grudge. Had she known Laura Wellman in her youth? Was there a personal vendetta at play, hidden beneath the surface of her calculated scheme? That evening, Poirot sat by the inn's fire, a glass of tisane in hand, his notebook open before him. He sketched a timeline, tracing Hopkins' movements from New Zealand to Maidensford. The sister she mentioned, could it be Mrs. Slattery, the village gossip who hinted at Mary's parentage? Or was there another connection, a thread tying Hopkins to the Wellman family's past? He made a note to investigate further, his pen moving with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls, and Poirot's thoughts turned to Elinor. Her composure was remarkable, but he sensed a woman caught in a webknot of her making. Her love for Roddy Wellman, her grief for her aunt, her quiet dignity in the face of accusation. These were not the traits of a murderer but of a soul tested by fate. Yet Poirot knew better than to let sentiment cloud his judgment. He would follow the evidence, wherever it led. The next morning, as the courtroom reconvened, Poirot's prediction proved correct. A chemist from London, Mr. Harold Grayson, took the stand, his report in hand. "The teapot from Hunterbury," he said, his voice clear and precise, "contained traces of apomorphine hydrochloride concentrated in the spout. This suggests it was added deliberately, likely after the tea was brewed." The gallery erupted, and Sir Edwin struggled to restore order. Mr. Hawes, red-faced, demanded to know how such evidence had been overlooked. Poirot, standing at the back, allowed himself a small nod. The quickness of air had done its work, bringing truth from afar and from the smallest details. Nurse Hopkins' deception was unraveling, and the path to Eleanor's freedom was growing clearer. But Poirot was not finished. He knew that Hopkins would not go quietly. Her cunning had carried her this far, and she would fight to protect her secrets. As the trial adjourned for lunch, he spotted her in the corridor, her face pale but her eyes defiant. She met his gaze, for a moment, and in that fleeting exchange, Poirot saw not fear but calculation. She was planning her next move, and he would be ready. Chapter 8. The Thornless Truth. The air in the village of Maidensford hung heavy with the scent of late summer blooms, but for Hercule Poirot it carried the faint, acrid temps of deception. The winding lanes of Hunterbury Estate, with its manicured hedges and sprawling rose gardens, had become a labyrinth of lies, and Poirot was determined to navigate its twists to uncover the truth. The Zephyrin Druin rose, with its thornless stems and vibrant pink petals, had become the silent witness to a crime, its very existence contradicting Nurse Jessie Hopkins' carefully constructed tale. As Poirot stood in the garden, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth, he felt the weight of the case pressing against his little grey cells. The trial of Elinor Carlisle loomed, and the clock ticked toward a verdict that could condemn an innocent woman, or let a cunning murderer walk free. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn as Poirot retraced his steps to the fateful spot where Nurse Hopkins had claimed a rose thorn pricked her wrist. The Zephyrin Druin climbed gracefully up a trellis near the kitchen door, its blooms nodding gently in the breeze. Poirot bent closer, his moustache twitching as he examined. The stems, not a single thorn marred their smooth, green surface. He straightened, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a confirmed suspicion. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, "the rose does not lie, but Nurse Hopkins. She weaves a tapestry of falsehoods." He turned to Horlick, the estate's grizzled gardener, who stood nearby, his hands stained with soil and his expression wary. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot," said, his voice precise yet warm, "you have tended these gardens for many years. N'est-ce pas? Tell me, these roses, the zephyrin, druin, have they ever borne thorns?" Hercule scratched his weathered cheek, his eyes narrowing as he sensed the weight of the question. "Never, sir," he replied, his voice rough as gravel. "Been growing since old Mrs. Wellman's time. Smooth as a baby's skin, those stems, not a prick to be had." Poirot nodded, his mind racing. The mark on Nurse Hopkins' wrist, which she had attributed to a rose-thorn scratch, was no accident of nature. It was a deliberate act, a self-inflicted wound to bolster her story of innocence in the face of Mary Gerrard's poisoning. But why? What drove this woman, with her starched uniform and practiced calm, to such lengths? Poirot's thoughts darted to the apomorphine hydrochloride, the emetic revealed in the courtroom, and the pieces of the puzzle began to align. Hopkins had not been a victim of the poisoned tea, she had orchestrated it, protecting herself while ensuring Mary's death. The detective's next move was to confront the woman herself, but not in the sterile confines of a courtroom or the oppressive atmosphere of a police station. No, Poirot preferred the battleground of Hunterbury, where the crime had unfolded, where every corner held a memory of the fatal day. He sent word to Nurse Hopkins, requesting her presence at the estate. Under the pretense of clarifying minor details for the defense, she arrived promptly, her steps brisk, and her face a mask of professional composure. But Poirot noted the slight tightening of her lips, the flicker of unease in her pale blue eyes. "Bonjour, Nurse Hopkins," Poirot greeted, standing in the drawing-room, its tall windows framing the gardens beyond. "You are most kind to indulge Hercule Poirot in this small matter. It is the little details, you understand, that illuminate the truth." Hopkins inclined her head, her hands clasped neatly before her. "Of course, Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice steady but cool. "I'm happy to help clear up any confusion. Poor Miss Carlisle's situation is dreadful, and I'd hate for there to be any misunderstanding." Poirot's smile was polite, almost disarming, but his eyes were sharp as he gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. Let us speak of that day, the day of the lunch at Hunterbury. You prepared the tea, I believe." "Yes," Hopkins replied, settling into the chair with a practiced ease. "I brewed it in the kitchen, as I often did when visiting. Miss Carlisle made the sandwiches. We all ate together, Miss Carlisle, Mary, and I. It was all so ordinary until poor Mary took ill." "Most tragic," Poirot said, his tone sympathetic, but his gaze unwavering. "And yet, there is something curious. Nurse Hopkins, you spoke of a mark on your wrist, a scratch from a rose-thorn. Nan, you said it occurred while you were in the garden, perhaps near the kitchen door." Hopkins' fingers twitched slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, that's right. I must have brushed against the roses while fetching something from the garden. It was nothing serious, just a small prick." Poirot tilted his head, his expression one of polite curiosity. "A small prick, you say? From the roses by the kitchen? The zephyrin druin, perhaps?" Her eyes flickered, but she maintained her composure. "I suppose so. I'm no gardener, Mr. Poirot. I don't know the names of the roses." "Nan, that is most interesting," Poirot said, pacing slowly before her. "For you see, Nurse Hopkins, the zephyrin druin is a rose most unique. It has no thorns, not a single one. And yet, you claim a thorn caused the mark on your wrist. How, I wonder, is this possible?" For a moment, silence hung in the room, heavy as the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Hopkins' face remained impassive, but her hands tightened in her lap, the knuckles whitening. I must have been mistaken," she said at last, her voice measured. "Perhaps it was another plant, or I scratched myself some other way. It was such a chaotic day." "Chaotic," Poirot agreed, stopping to face her. "And yet, your memory is so precise in other matters. The preparation of the tea, the washing of the dishes alone, I note, while Miss Carlisle and Mary were elsewhere. And then there is the matter of your pallor, Nurse Hopkins. Ted Bigland, the village lad, remarked that you looked unwell after the lunch, before Mary's symptoms appeared. Curious, is it not?" Hopkins' lips parted, but no words came. Poirot pressed on, his voice soft but relentless. "And the apomorphine, Nurse Hopkins, the torn label found at Hunterbury, which you claimed was morphine, but it was not, was it? Apomorphine, an emetic, would explain your pallor, your solitude in The kitchen, you injected yourself. Nest CP, to induce vomiting, to ensure the poison in the tea did not affect you, while poor Mary Gerrard drank her death. The accusation landed like a stone, and for the first time, a crack appeared in Hopkins' facade. Her eyes widened, and her breath hitched, but she quickly regained control. "That's absurd, Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm a nurse, not a murderer. I cared for Mrs. Wellman, for Mary. Why would I do such a thing? Why, indeed?" Poirot mused, his tone almost conversational. "Perhaps because you knew more than you let on, Nurse Hopkins. About Mary Gerrard, for instance, about her true parentage. The village whispers. They speak of Laura Wellman and Sir Lewis Rycroft, of a child born in secret. Mary, the daughter of wealth, stood to inherit a fortune if the truth were known. And you, with your years of service, your proximity to the Wellman family, you knew, did you not?" Hopkins' face paled, and her hands gripped the arms of the chair. "You're grasping at straws, Mr. Poirot," she said, but her voice trembled. "Village gossip is hardly evidence." "Nan, but it is a thread," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "And Hercule Poirot follows every thread. Let us consider another. The anonymous letter, the one that warned of danger to Mrs. Wellman. It was you who brought it to light, was it not? A clever move, to cast suspicion on others, to muddy the waters. But it was your hand that penned it, Nurse Hopkins, to ensure that Elinor and Roddy would be watched, suspected, while you moved unseen." The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick with tension. Hopkins rose abruptly, her face flushed. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "I won't sit here and be accused of such things. I'm a respected nurse, Mr. Poirot, and I've done nothing but help this family." "Help?" Poirot's voice was sharp now, cutting through her protest. "You helped yourself, Nurse Hopkins, to opportunity, to knowledge, to the chance to eliminate a rival claimant to Laura Wellman's fortune. You knew Mary's secret, and you saw her as a threat. The morphine in the tea, the apomorphine to save yourself fit, was all so carefully planned. But you did not account for Hercule Poirot, for the little grey cells that see what others miss." Hopkins took a step back, her eyes darting to the door, but Poirot's presence seemed to fill the room, his calm certainty pinning her in place. "Sit, Nurse Hopkins," he said, his voice low but commanding. "We are not finished. There is more to uncover, and you will help me. Let us speak of New Zealand, of your time there, of the acquaintances who have so recently arrived to share their stories." Her face froze, and for the first time, true fear flickered in her eyes. Poirot had struck a nerve. The witnesses from New Zealand, summoned by his quickness of air travel, had revealed a pattern: a nurse who befriended wealthy patients, who maneuvered herself into their confidence, who left behind whispers of missing funds and convenient deaths. Hopkins had believed her past buried, but Poirot had unearthed it, piece by damning piece. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was a whisper now, her composure crumbling. "Nan, then, let me enlighten you," Poirot said, stepping closer. "In Auckland, there was a patient, a Mrs. Carver, who died unexpectedly after altering her will. In Christchurch, a Mr. Langley, whose fortune mysteriously dwindled before his passing. Always, you were there, Nurse Hopkins, with your kind smile and your steady hand, and always, there was a benefit to you, a small inheritance, a gift, a step closer to the life you desired. Here at Hunterbury, you saw your chance. Laura Wellman's death left a fortune unclaimed, and Mary Gerrard, the secret heir, stood in your way." Hopkins' breath came in short gasps, her hands trembling. "You can't prove any of this," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Au contraire," Poirot replied, his tone almost gentle now. "The evidence is in the details, Nurse Hopkins. The thornless rose, the apomorphine, the letter, your pallor, your lies. They form a chain, unbreakable, that leads to you. And soon, in the courtroom, Hercule Poirot will lay this chain before the world, and the truth will be known." She sank back into the chair, her face ashen, her eyes fixed on some distant point. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock on the mantel. Then, in a voice barely audible, she whispered, "I only wanted what was fair. After years of serving, of scraping by, I deserved more." Poirot's expression softened, but only slightly. "Nan, Nurse Hopkins," he said, "you deserved justice, as does Mary Gerrard, and justice you shall have. As he turned to leave, summoning Dr. Peter Lord to escort Hopkins to the authorities, Poirot felt a pang of sorrow, not for Hopkins, whose greed had led to murder, but for the lives torn apart by her actions. Elinor, Mary, Laura Wellman. The rose garden outside seemed to sigh in the breeze, its thornless blooms a quiet testament to the truth Poirot had uncovered. The stage was set for the courtroom, where the final act of this tragedy would play out. Hopkins' confession, though whispered, was a crack in the dam, and Poirot knew the flood of truth would soon follow. As he stepped into the sunlight, his mind already turning to his testimony, he murmured to himself, "The cypress may be sad, but the truth, it is never silent." Chapter 9. The Veil of Deception. The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy, a hive of whispers and shifting glances, as the trial of Elinor Carlisle reached its crescendo. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of justice hanging like a storm cloud over the oak-panelled chamber. Spectators leaned forward, their breaths shallow, eyes darting between the poised figure of Elinor in the dock and the small, dapper man who stood at the center of it, all Hercule Poirot. His mustache gleamed under the gaslight chandeliers, a beacon of calm amid the tempest of accusations. Today, he would unveil the truth, peeling back layers of deception as deftly as one might strip the petals from a poisoned rose. The judge, a stern figure cloaked in scarlet, adjusted his spectacles and called for order. His gavel struck the bench with a crack that silenced the murmurs. "Monsieur Poirot," he intoned, his voice a gravelly command, "you have been granted leave to present your findings. Proceed." Poirot stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. He carried no notes, no props, only the sharp clarity of his mind, honed by years of unraveling human deceit. His eyes, bright and piercing, swept the room, taking in the jury's furrowed brows, the prosecution's smug confidence, and Elinor's pale, composed face. She sat, motionless, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of hope, a spark kindled by Poirot's relentless pursuit of truth. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," Poirot began, his voice smooth yet commanding, carrying a faint Belgian lilt that lent an air of exotic authority. "We stand today at the precipice of justice, where truth and falsehood wrestle for supremacy. The case against Mademoiselle Elinor Carlisle appears, at first glance, to be a tapestry tightly woven jealousy, opportunity, and the deadly poison morphine. But I, Hercule Poirot, submit to you that this tapestry is flawed, its threads knotted by the hand of a cunning deceiver. Today, I shall unravel it." A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly stifled by the judge's glare. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly, his movements deliberate. "Let us return to the heart of this tragedy. Death of Mary Gerrard, a young woman of promise, struck down by poison at Hunterbury. The prosecution claims Mademoiselle Carlisle, driven by a lover's scorn, administered morphine in a sandwich or tea. But I ask you, where is the proof? Where is the certainty that points solely to her hand?" The lead prosecutor, Mr. Seddon, rose, his thin lips curling into a sneer. "Monsieur Poirot, the evidence is clear. Miss Carlisle had fiance's wandering affections. She had access to morphine from her aunt's medical supplies, and she alone prepared the sandwiches served at that fatal lunch. Are you suggesting we ignore these facts?" Poirot turned to Seddon, his expression one of polite amusement. "Monsieur, facts are like stars, brilliant in isolation, but only when aligned do they form a constellation of truth. You present motive, access, and opportunity, yet you overlook the shadows cast by another. Allow me to illuminate them." He turned to the jury, his voice rising with a theatrical cadence. "Consider the scene of the crime, a simple lunch at Hunterbury, with 3 women present: Elinor Carlisle, Mary Gerrard, and Nurse Jessie Hopkins. Sandwiches were shared by all, yet only Mary succumbed to morphine. The tea, brewed by Nurse Hopkins, was consumed by Mary and Hopkins alone. Curious, is it not, that Nurse Hopkins, who drank the same tea, emerged unscathed?" A gasp echoed from the gallery. Poirot paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But there is more. A torn label, dismissed as a fragment of morphine packaging, was found at Hunterbury. The prosecution assumed it confirmed their narrative. Yet Mies Amos, this label was not for morphine but for apomorphine, hydrochlorodan emetic, a substance that induces vomiting. Why would such a drug be present at a scene of poisoning? I propose it was no accident." The courtroom stirred, jurors exchanging glances. Elinor's fingers tightened around the edge of the dock, her eyes fixed on Poirot. Dr. Peter Lord, seated in the gallery, leaned forward, his face a mixture of awe and apprehension. Poirot continued, undeterred. "Let us examine Nurse Jessie Hopkins, a woman of experience, trusted to care for the ailing Laura Wellman, yet her actions on that fateful day raise questions. She alone washed the dishes after the lunch, insisting on solitude in the kitchen. She appeared pale, unwell, yet she attributed this to a mere rose-thorn scratch. A scratch, I might add, on a wrist that bore no mark of a thorn, for the roses at Hunterbury, the Zephyrin, Druin, are thornless." The judge leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Monsieur Poirot, are you suggesting Nurse Hopkins falsified her injury?" "Precisement, Your Honor," Poirot replied, his eyes gleaming. "The mark on her wrist was no accident of nature, but a deliberate needle's prick, perhaps, to administer apomorphine to herself. Why? To expel the poisoned tea she drank alongside Mary Gerrard, ensuring her own survival while Mary perished." The prosecution erupted in objection, Seddon's voice sharp. "This is speculation, Your Honor. There is no evidence Nurse Hopkins injected herself with anything." Poirot raised a hand, silencing the outcry with his calm authority. "Patience, Monsieur Seddon. The evidence lies not only in the physical but in the human heart. Let us turn to motive. Why would Nurse Hopkins orchestrate such a crime? To answer this, we must journey to the past. 2 secrets buried in the village of May." He paused, turning to face the jury directly, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial tone. "Mary Gerrard was no ordinary villager. Gossip, that most persistent of truths, whispered that she was the illegitimate daughter of Laura Wellman and Sir Lewis Rycroft. If true, Mary stood to inherit a portion of Laura's fortune. Nurse Hopkins, through her proximity to the Wellman household, knew well. But with Laura's death intestate, the estate passed to Elinor Carlisle unless another claimant emerged. The courtroom was silent now, every ear straining to catch Poirot's words. Nurse Hopkins had a history. Ms. Amis, witnesses from New Zealand, brought by the quickness of air travel, have revealed her past a nurse who befriended wealthy patients, only to benefit from their demise. At Hunterbury, she saw opportunity. By eliminating Mary Gerrard, she ensured no rival claim to the Wellman fortune, positioning herself to manipulate the outcome perhaps through blackmail or influence over those who remained. A woman in the gallery gasped, clutching her handkerchief. Poirot's gaze flickered toward Nurse Hopkins, who sat among the witnesses, her face pale but composed. Her eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of fear. "But there is more," Poirot continued, his voice rising. "The anonymous letter that first alerted Elinor and Roddy Wellman to danger. Letter warning of someone meddling at Hunterbury was no act of kindness. It was penned by Nurse Hopkins herself, a calculated move to cast suspicion on Elinor and Roddy, to muddy the waters and divert attention from her own actions." The judge's brow furrowed. "Monsieur Poirot, this is a grave accusation. Have you evidence to support this claim?" Poirot nodded, producing a folded sheet from his pocket. "This letter, Your Honor, bears a faint watermark as stationery unique to the Hunterbury Lodge, where Nurse Hopkins resided. The handwriting, though disguised, matches samples of her correspondence, as confirmed by a graphologist. She sought to frame Mademoiselle Carlisle, to paint her as a jealous lover driven to murder." Elinor's eyes widened, a tear escaping down her cheek. Peter Lord gripped the railing before him, his knuckles white. The jury sat riveted, their earlier certainty shaken. "Let us reconstruct the crime," Poirot said, his voice now a steady drumbeat of logic. "Nurse Hopkins brewed the tea, lacing it with morphine from the tube she claimed was lost. She drank it alongside Mary, knowing she had already injected herself with apomorphine, which would expel the poison from her system. She washed the dishes to erase any trace of her tampering. The sandwiches, prepared by Elinor, were a red herring to point the finger at an innocent woman." Seddon rose again, his face flushed. "This is preposterous. Why would Nurse Hopkins risk her own life with such a scheme?" Poirot's smile was cold. "Because, monsieur, she is a woman of precision. She calculated the dose of to protect herself, timing her actions with the skill of a seasoned nurse. Her pallor, her solitude in the kitchen, these were not signs of guilt, but of survival. She played the part of the innocent bystander, all while orchestrating a murder." The courtroom erupted in whispers, the judge's gavel striking for order. Nurse Hopkins shifted in her seat, her hands clenched in her lap. Poirot turned to her, his gaze unrelenting. "Nurse Hopkins," he said softly, "will you deny that you knew of Mary Gerrard's parentage, that you saw her as a threat to the fortune you hoped to control? Will you deny the apomorphine, the letter, the thornless rose?" Hopkins rose, her voice trembling but defiant. "I deny it all. This is nonsense, Monsieur Poirot. I cared for Mary, for Mrs. Wellman. I had no reason to harm anyone." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Then explain, Madame, why your wrist bore a mark with no thorn to cause it. Explain why you alone survived the tea. Explain the letter in your hand." Hopkins faltered, her lips parting, but no words came. The courtroom held its breath, the silence deafening. The judge leaned forward, his voice stern. "Nurse Hopkins, you will answer the question." She sank back into her seat, her face crumpling. I cannot," she whispered. Poirot turned to the jury, his voice ringing with conviction. "The veil of deception has been lifted. Mies Amos. Elinor Carlisle is no murderer. The true culprit stands exposed. Her motives laid burgreed, ambition, and a heart cold enough to poison a young woman's dreams. I ask you to deliver justice, to free an innocent woman and hold the guilty to account." The jury exchanged glances, their faces a mix of shock and resolve. Elinor's shoulders sagged, a sob escaping her lips. Peter Lord reached out instinctively, as if to bridge the distance between them. The prosecution's table was silent, Sedin's earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. The judge cleared his throat. "The court will adjourn to consider Monsieur Poirot's testimony. We reconvene tomorrow for the jury's verdict." As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in a cacophony of voices. Spectators surged forward, reporters scribbling furiously. Poirot stepped back, his work done for now, his grey cells humming with satisfaction. Elinor caught his eye, mouthing a silent thank you as she was led from the dock. Peter Lord approached, his face alight with gratitude. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've saved her. I knew you could." Poirot inclined his head. "The truth, doctor, is a stubborn thing. It will not be buried for long." As the crowd dispersed, Poirot lingered, his gaze resting on Nurse Hopkins, now flanked by officers. Her mask had slipped, revealing the desperation beneath. The sad Cypress of this tale, a symbol of death and deceit, was nearing its fall, but the final act awaited. Tomorrow, the jury would speak, and justice would claim its due. Chapter 10. The Cypress Falls. The courtroom was a cavern of echoes, its high ceilings trapping the murmurs of the crowd as the judge's gavel fell with a final, resolute crack. Elinor Carlisle stood, her pale hands clasped tightly before her, as the words "not guilty" reverberated through the chamber. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators, some leaning forward in disbelief, others sinking back in relief. The air was thick with the weight of justice served, yet the undercurrent of unease lingered, as if the truth, now unveiled, carried a shadow of its own. Hercule Poirot, seated in the gallery, adjusted his perfectly knotted tie, his mustache twitching with quiet satisfaction. The case was solved, the killer unmasked. But the story of Hunterbury and its secrets was far from over. Outside the courthouse, the late July sun cast a golden haze over the cobblestone streets, softening the harsh edges of the day's drama. Elinor emerged, her steps tentative, as if testing the ground of her newfound freedom. Dr. Peter Lord, his boyish face alight with hope, hurried to her side, his coat flapping in the warm breeze. "Elinor," he said softly, his voice a lifeline, in the sea of reporters clamoring for a statement, "you're free. It's over." She turned to him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Is it ever truly over, Peter?" Her voice was low, almost lost in the din, but it carried a weight that made him pause. The trial had stripped away her defenses, exposing the raw edges of a woman who had faced death and betrayal. Yet there was a spark in her gaze, a flicker of resilience that refused to be extinguished. Poirot approached, his small, precise steps cutting through the crowd with an authority that belied his diminutive stature. "Mademoiselle Carlisle," he said, tipping his hat, "the wheels of justice have turned, and they have turned in your favor. But I sense there is more you wish to understand. N'est-ce pas?" Elinor's lips parted, a question forming, but, before she could speak, a journalist thrust a notebook forward, his pencil poised like a weapon. "Miss Carlisle, how does it feel to escape the gallows? Was it Poirot's genius, or your innocence, that saved you?" Poirot raised a hand, his expression one of polite disdain. "Monsieur, the truth is not a spectacle for your headlines. It is a delicate flower, cultivated with care and precision. Now, if you please, Mademoiselle Carlisle has endured enough for one day." The reporter shrank back, and Peter guided Elinor toward a waiting car, Poirot following with a measured stride. As they settled into the plush seats, the engine humming to life, Elinor leaned back, her hands smoothing the folds of her skirt. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice steadier now, "I owe you my life, but I need to know, how did you see through it all? Nurse Hopkins, the tea, the letter, it was so carefully woven." Poirot's eyes gleamed, his love for unraveling, a mystery evident in the slight curve of his lips. "Mademoiselle, the mind of Hercule Poirot is a garden of order, where chaos cannot thrive. Allow me to recount the tapestry of deception, and you shall see how each thread was unraveled." The car wound through the countryside, the rolling hills of Maidensford, a blur of green and gold beyond the windows. Poirot's voice, rich and deliberate, filled the space as he began his tale. It began with the letter, anonymous and insidious, warning of danger to Madame Laura Wellman. Such letters, they are not written without purpose. They are the whisper of a guilty conscience, or, in this case, the bait of a cunning mind. Nurse Jessie Hopkins penned it, not to protect, but to cast suspicion on you and Monsieur Roddy Wellman. Elinor's breath caught, her fingers tightening round the edge of her seat. But why? Why go to such lengths? Poirot raised a finger, his gesture commanding attention. "Patience, mademoiselle. The motive was not merely jealousy or spite, as the prosecution so eagerly claimed. It was greed, a serpent coiled around the heart of Hunterbury. Nurse Hopkins knew a secret, one that could have reshaped the inheritance of Laura Wellman's fortune. Mary Gerrard, the young woman you were accused of poisoning, was not merely the daughter of Ephraim Gerrard, the lodgekeeper. She was, in truth, the illegitimate child of Laura Wellman and Sir Lewis Rickcroft." Peter's eyes widened, his medical mind grappling with the implications. Laura's daughter, but how did Hopkins know? Poirot's moustache twitched, a sign of his relish for the reveal. Hopkins was no ordinary nurse. She was a spider, weaving her web over years. She had served in New Zealand, where she befriended a woman named Eliza Gerrard, Mary's supposed mother. Eliza, on her deathbed, confided the truth. Mary was not her child but Laura's, born of a forbidden love and entrusted to the Gerrards to raise as their own. Hopkins saw opportunity in this secret. When Laura Wellman fell ill, Hopkins positioned herself at Hunterbury, gaining Laura's trust while quietly observing the family dynamics. Elinor's voice was barely a whisper. "So Mary's death, it was about the money." "Persistent," Poirot said, his tone grave. "Laura's death without a will meant her estate would pass to you, mademoiselle, as her closest kin. But if Mary's true parentage were revealed, she could claim a share, perhaps even the entirety, as Laura's only child." Hopkins, aware of this, saw a path to profit. She befriended Mary, gained her confidence, and learned of her plans to study abroad, plans that would remove her from Hunterbury and delay any claim. But Hopkins was impatient. She devised a plan to eliminate Mary, framing you in the process. The car slowed as they approached Hunterbury, its ivy-clad walls looming like a silent witness to the tragedy. Elinor stared at the estate, her expression a mix of nostalgia and pain. "The lunch," she said, her voice trembling. "That day, I thought I was going mad. The sandwiches, the tea, all seemed so ordinary." Poirot nodded, his eyes narrowing as he recalled the scene. The lunch was the stage for Hopkins' performance. She prepared the tea, lacing it with morphine from a tube she claimed was lost. But she was clever, oh so clever. She injected herself with apomorphine hydrochloride, an emetic, to induce vomiting and avoid the poison's effects. This explained her pallor, her rush to the kitchen to wash the dishes alone. The sandwiches, which you all ate, were safe. The tea, which only Mary and Hopkins drank, was the instrument of death. Peter shook his head, his jaw tight. "And the Rosethorn story, that was her cover." "Exactement," Poirot said, his voice sharp with indignation. "The Druin, a thornless rose, betrayed her lie. She claimed a scratch on her wrist from a rose, but such a mark could only have come from her own needle, used to administer the apomorphine. It was a small detail, but to Hercule Poirot, no detail is too small. The torn label, the inconsistencies in her story, the whispers of her past in New Zealand all pointed to her guilt." Elinor's eyes glistened, not with tears but with a fierce clarity. "She manipulated everyone, Roddy, Mary, even me. I hated her. Monsieur Poirot, I hated Mary for taking Roddy's affection, but I never wished her dead. Poirot's gaze softened, a rare moment of empathy breaking through his analytical facade. Mademoiselle, the heart is a complex thing, but it is not a murderer. Your pain was real, but it was Hopkins who turned it into a weapon. She exploited your broken engagement, your aunt's death, and the village's gossip to weave a narrative of your guilt. But the truth, it always finds a way to bloom, like a flower in the cracks of a stone. The car came to a stop before Hunterbury's gates, and the trio stepped out, the gravel crunching underfoot. The estate, once a place of warmth and memory, now stood as a monument to betrayal. Elinor wrapped her arms around herself, the summer breeze doing little to warm the chill in her bones. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small but resolute. "Hunterbury, the fortune. It all feels tainted." Peter took a step closer, his hand hovering near her shoulder, hesitant yet protective. "You don't have to decide today, Elinor. The estate can be sold, the money used for something good. You're free to start anew." Poirot tilted his head, studying her with a keen eye. "Monsieur Lord speaks wisely. The cypress, it is a symbol of mourning, but also of endurance. You have faced the shadow of death, mademoiselle, and emerged stronger. What you do next is yours to choose." Elinor turned to face the house, her gaze tracing the familiar lines of its facade. "I used to dream of living here with Roddy," she admitted, her voice steady, despite the ache in her words. "But that dream died long before Mary did. I think I want to let it go. All of it." Peter's face softened, a quiet hope lighting his eyes. "If you're sure, I can help. There are charities, causes Laura would have supported. We could turn this tragedy into something meaningful." Poirot nodded approvingly. "A noble choice, mademoiselle. To transform pain into purpose is the mark of a soul that has endured." They walked through the gardens, the air heavy with the scent of roses and earth. The Zephyrin Druin stood proudly among the flower beds, its thornless stems a silent testament to Poirot's triumph. Elinor paused beside it, her fingers brushing the soft petals. "It's strange," she said, almost to herself. "This rose was the key to my freedom, yet it feels like it belongs to another life." Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "Every life has its seasons. Mademoiselle, the cypress falls, but new growth follows. You are not bound to the past." As they reached the edge of the garden, a figure emerged from the shadows of the hedge, a young woman, her face familiar yet out of place. It was Rose Biglin, Ted's sister, who had lingered on the fringes of the village gossip. Her eyes were wide, her hands twisting nervously. "Miss Carlisle," she said, her voice trembling. I heard you were free. I wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything we all thought." Elinor's expression softened, though the weight of the villagers' judgment lingered in her eyes. "You believed what you were told, Rose. I don't blame you." Rose hesitated, then pressed a small wrapped bundle into Elinor's hands. "It's from Ted. He found it in Mary's things after everything. He thought you should have it." Elinor unwrapped the bundle, revealing a delicate silver locket. Inside was a faded photograph of Laura Wellman, her smile radiant and young. A note, in Laura's elegant script, read, "To my Mary, my heart's secret." Elinor's breath hitched, and she closed the locket with a soft click. She loved her, she whispered, even if no one else knew. Poirot watched silently, his mind cataloguing the moment. "The heart keeps its secrets, mademoiselle, but it also speaks its truth. This locket is a reminder of love, not loss." Peter placed a hand on Elinor's arm, his touch steadying. "You don't have to carry this alone, Elinor. Not anymore." She nodded, a small, determined smile breaking through. "I know, and I won't." The days that followed were a whirlwind of decisions and farewells. Hunterbury was put up for sale, its proceeds designated for a scholarship fund in Laura Wellman's name, to support young women like Mary who dreamed of a brighter future. Elinor, with Peter's quiet support, began to rebuild her life, not in the shadow of Hunterbury, but in the light of new possibilities. They spent evenings walking the cliffs of Maidensford, the sea's rhythm a counterpoint to their conversations about the future. Poirot, meanwhile, prepared to return to London, his work in Maidensford complete. On his final evening, he sat with Elinor and Peter in a small inn, the fire crackling as they shared a modest dinner. "Monsieur Poirot," Elinor said, her voice warm with gratitude, "I don't know how to thank you. You saw what no one else." Cliff Poirot waved a hand, his eyes twinkling. The little grey cells, they do not rest until the truth is found. But I confess, mademoiselle, it is your strength that has impressed me most. You faced the abyss and did not falter. Peter raised his glass, a playful grin softening his earnest demeanor, to Poirot's grey cells and to Elinor's courage. Elinor laughed, a sound that felt foreign yet welcome. And to new beginnings, she added, her glass meeting theirs in a quiet toast. As the firelight danced across their faces, Poirot leaned back, his mind already turning to the next mystery. The Cypress had fallen, its mournful shadow lifted, but the world was full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. For now, though, he savored the moment, rare pause in a life dedicated to unraveling the human heart. The inn's windows framed the night sky, where stars glittered like the fragments of a solved puzzle. Hunterbury's secrets were buried, its ghosts laid to rest, and in their place, a new story was beginning, one of hope, redemption, and the enduring power of truth.